Owen Marston's story ends in a barn. A man stands alone at Beecher's Hope, dust in the air, sunlight cutting through the cracks in the wood, the echo of government rifles waiting outside. One last breath, one last look at the world he tried to build, and then the doors swing open into a storm of lead. It is a brutal ending, but it is not the beginning. The very beginning is a rope around a boy's neck and a promise that this lost soul would not die so easily. Years before that final stand, before the ranch and the plow and the fragile dream of peace, an 8-year-old orphan dangled from a makeshift gallows, beaten by reform schools, abandoned by any real family. He was already half ghost when Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews cut him down. From its humble beginnings, this was presented as a rescue, a rebirth, a story of salvation through outlaw freedom. In truth, it was an adoption into a different kind of cage, built not from iron bars but from loyalty, philosophy, and debt that could never be fully repaid. Around that boy, the gang grew into the living embodiment of a changing America. Romantic tales of train robbers and stagecoach bandits collided with railroads, telegraphs, and government files. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the van der Linde gang stood right on that fault line, preaching freedom while running from civilization. Dutch spoke about ideals and justice, Hosea spun schemes, and John became the golden boy who proved their vision could survive. Yet even in those idealistic years, every successful robbery, every campfire speech, bound him tighter to men who would one day demand everything in return. This is a story of loyalty turned into a weapon, of dreams that hardened into delusions. John's need for family, his hunger to belong after a childhood of abandonment, became the perfect handle for others to grip. Dutch could praise him as a son one day and condemn him as a traitor the next. The government would later do the same, holding Abigail and Jack as hostages to force their reluctant gunman back into the role of killer. Was that freedom, or just a new uniform for the same chains? Across this saga, John moves from abused orphan to Dutch's favored proc, from swaggering outlaw to disillusioned skeptic, from government hound to doomed rancher and father. Each transformation promises escape, yet each one drags Dutch's shadow behind him. Even at Beecher's Hope, where he trades train robberies for cattle and gun smoke for fence posts, the past rides up his driveway in the form of Edgar Ross in the United States Army. This video will follow that entire path in the truest sense. The boy at the rope, the prodigal son who disappears and returns to a colder camp, the man forced to hunt Bill, Javier, and Dutch, and the father who steps out of a barn to die for a family he can never truly protect. The central question hangs over every chapter. Did John Marston ever escape, or did he only trade one master for another, right up until the moment those barn doors open? This is a story of one life stretched across a dying century, from its humble beginnings in dirt and hunger to a final stand in a wooden barn. To understand John Marston, the timeline has to be laid out plain. Because his arc is the thread that runs from the 1870s gallows to the gunsmoke of the early 1910s. It begins in the very beginning of his memory, with loss. John's mother dies when he is young. His father is a drifting, half-blind outlaw who disappears soon after, and the boy is shunted into reform school. There, civilization means beatings, discipline means starvation, and the promise of rehabilitation is just another word for abuse. By the time John runs, the world was changing, but not for him. He is a starving thief on the road, an easy body for a rope. From that hanging rope to his last breath, this story covers 4 decades. The 1870s, when Dutch and Hosea cut him down and claim him as their own. The 1880s and 1890s, when the van der Linde gang rides high, robbing trains and banks and stagecoaches with an almost idealistic swagger. And the early 1910s, when the United States government drags John back into the blood he thought he had buried, using his love for Abigail and Jack as a weapon. Complete story here means more than missions and cutscenes. It means the campfire stories where Hosea quietly admits he and Dutch found John as a boy. It means Abigail's bitter asides about all the men she had to endure before John chose to grow up. It means the off-screen year when John disappears before 1899, leaving Dutch wounded and Arthur resentful. The living embodiment of the gang's promise and its betrayal is not just in the big set pieces. It is in those throwaway conversations, those glances across a dying camp. Structurally, the path is clear. First, the child at the rope, rescued and remade. Then, the eager Proc in the gang's heyday, learning Dutch's philosophy of freedom while Hosea teaches him how the world really works. Then the lover who fails Abigail and Jack, running off when family becomes heavier than robbery. After that, the 1899 collapse, Arthur's illness and awakening, and John's slow realization that the old ways were dying, not just in the world outside, but inside Dutch himself. From there, the noose changes hands. Government agents trade badges for ropes, forcing John to hunt Bill, Javier, and finally Dutch, turning the faithful son into the necessary traitor. His ranch at Beecher's Hope, his brief taste of honest work, and his final sacrifice complete the circle that began on that lonely road. Because before the Pinkertons, before Blackwater, before Beecher's Hope, there's only a boy and a tree. A makeshift gallows creaks in the wind. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews ride up, two outlaws who might have robbed him on another day, and make a different choice. They cut the child down. That is where John Marston's story truly begins. John Marston's story does not begin with a gun in his hand. It begins with an absence. A father who vanishes in a barroom brawl, a mother who fades away from, causes no doctor bothers to name, and a boy left to drift through a world that has no place for him. From its humble beginnings, his life is a catalog of institutions rather than memories. A drunk, failing outlaw sires him and then dies on a filthy floor, skull cracked over an argument about nothing. His mother, exhausted and sick, follows him into the ground before John is old enough to understand the word orphan. After that, it is charity homes with too many beds and not enough blankets, reform schools where the lesson is pain, and long stretches of road walked alone between one disappointment and the next. In those places, the old ways were dying, but what replaced them was not compassion. It was order, wardens with sticks who preached civilization while breaking teeth. Older boys who learned quickly that the weak were meat and the strong ate first. Hunger becomes his closest companion. Bruises become a second skin. He learns that food is never guaranteed, that trust is dangerous, that promises from adults are just another form of betrayal. This is not the education of an idealistic child. It is the making of a stray. Beatings for talking back, beatings for staying quiet, beatings for breathing too loud in a dormitory that smells of sweat and disinfectant. John watches smaller boys dragged from their bunks, watches them come back changed, and understands in the truest sense that no one is coming to save him. If there is any freedom in this world, it will have to be stolen. So when an older kid whispers about an easy score, a traveler with a fat purse on a lonely road, the 8-year-old does not hear danger. He hears dinner. He hears a chance to not go to bed starving. What does a child know of robbery, of the philosophy of crime, of being an outlaw in a country that insists it is civilized? He knows only that his ribs hurt and his stomach is empty. The robbery is pathetic. A rock in a shaking hand, a mumbled demand, a terrified boy more rabbit than wolf. The traveler panics, John runs, and within hours men with badges and rope decide an example must be made. Civilization, after all, must be seen to be strong. They drag him to a tree at the edge of nowhere. No judge, no jury, just a boy and a rope and a crowd that wants to believe this is justice. The world was changing, but lynching a child still passes for law. He kicks, he chokes, he feels the world narrowing to a burning line around his neck. Then hooves. Voices, two riders who might have been there to rob the same road, rein it in instead. Dutch van der Linde sees a dangling child and sees himself. Younger, angrier, unbroken, Hosea Matthews sees the same thing, and where Dutch feels outrage, Hosea feels opportunity. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, takes its first real breath in that moment. Dutch does not arrive as a savior in white. He arrives as an outlaw who hates the sight of power crushing the powerless. With a few sharp words and a sharper stare, he scatters the crowd that had been so brave a minute before. A knife flashes. The rope snaps. John drops, gagging, onto the dirt. Hosea is there before he can crawl away, steadying him, hand on his shoulder, voice low and oddly gentle for a man who makes his living lying. Above him, the sun burns in Dutch's hair, Hosea's shadow falls across his face, and the boy sees not two strangers, but the living embodiment of an impossible promise, that family can be chosen, that the noose is not the only future. Does he understand what it will cost him? Of course not. He only knows he is alive, that the rope is gone, and that these men are offering a horse instead of a grave. His loyalty is born there, in dust and bruises and half-choked breaths, long before he knows the word. As Dutch lifts him up and Hosea swings into the saddle, the tree and its broken rope shrink behind them. Ahead lies a campfire, a gang, a new name for what John has never truly had, family. But every family has a price, and the next time John faces a rope, there will be no Dutch riding in. Dutch and Hosea do not ride away from that tree as simple rescuers. In their minds, they are founders, architects, building something bigger than one frightened boy clawing at his throat. From its humble beginnings, this is not just a gang forming in the dust. It is, in Dutch's words, a philosophy on horseback. At this stage, Dutch van der Linde is all heat and horizon. He is charismatic in the truest sense, a man who can turn a campfire into a pulpit and a robbery into a sermon about freedom. Even then, he speaks of civilization as a cage, of governments and railroads and bankers tightening a noose around the old world. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch insists that only those brave enough to live outside the law can stay truly human. He talks in long, rolling sentences about liberty, about self-determination, about how men are not born to be owned. Beside him, Hosea Matthews is quieter, but sharper. Where Dutch looks at the sky, Hosea watches hands, eyes, the weight of a man's step. Dutch sees a story of rebellion, Hosea sees the angles that keep everyone breathing tomorrow. A con man by trade, he can read a mark in a heartbeat, can tell who will pull a gun and who will fold. For Dutch, ideals come first, and the plan comes second. For Hosea, survival is the only proof that any philosophy is worth believing in. Together, they look at John and justify what they have done. Dutch tells himself he has rescued a lost soul from a corrupt system that would rather hang a child than ask why he steals. Is this not proof, he argues, that civilization is the true outlaw? Hosea, though, counts the practical blessings. A boy small enough to slip through windows, quick enough to ride hard, desperate enough to learn to shoot and lie with conviction. One sees a disciple, the other sees an apprentice. Their early relationship with John reflects that double vision. It is not parental in any gentle domestic sense. It is rough apprenticeship, campfire schooling, a family forged in gunsmoke and stolen coin. Dutch teaches John to read the world through grand ideas, to believe that every train they rob is a blow for freedom. Hosea teaches him to case those trains, to spot Pinkerton agents in a crowded depot, to know when to run. Affection is there, but it comes with bruises, with harsh words, with constant movement from town to town. In saving John from the rope, Dutch gives him life. But there is a cost hidden in that gift. From the very beginning, Dutch speaks as if that life now belongs to the gang, as if every breath is borrowed against a debt of loyalty that can never truly be repaid. John does not yet understand it, but he has stepped into a story of family and ownership, of dreams and obligations. That will follow him to his final stand. John's new life begins not with a gun in his hand, but with ink on a page. Around the campfire, under stolen lantern light, Dutch lays out pilfered newspapers and dojeered books taken from trains and stagecoaches, trophies from a world that calls itself civilized. He reads headlines about railroads, tariffs, and hanging laws, then turns each one into a sermon about freedom and government oppression. To Dutch, every column is proof that civilization is a con, that the powerful write the rules and call it justice. For John, barely more than a child, it is revelation. He struggles over the letters, sounding out words while Dutch corrects him with theatrical patience, then pivots into philosophy. A story of corrupt judges becomes a parable about resistance. A report on a land dispute becomes an argument that property is theft. From its humble beginnings, this education is weaponized. Reading is not just a skill. It is an initiation into Dutch's worldview. In the truest sense, Dutch is crafting not only a student, but a disciple. Hosea, watching from the edge of the firelight, offers a different curriculum. At dawn, while Dutch still sleeps off his speeches, Hosea takes John into crowded towns and rail depots. He teaches him how to move with the flow of bodies, how to feel for a wallet without looking down, how to spot the nervous man with too much money and too little sense. Where Dutch talks about ideals, Hosea talks about angles. Where Dutch rails against civilization, Hosea studies it, then robs it blind. There is a quiet irony in those lessons. The boy who was nearly hanged for stealing now learns how to steal properly, from professionals. Hosea shows him how to lie with a straight face to a lawman, how to smile at a shopkeeper while marking the safe in the back room. Dutch gives John a story about freedom. Hosea gives him the tools to survive that story when the bullets start flying. Emotionally, John clings to it all with desperate intensity. He is a lost soul, starved for affection, measuring his worth in every rare word of praise. When Dutch calls him son, when Hosea ruffles his hair after a clean lift, it feels like a blessing. Is this what family is meant to be? A gang of outlaws treating a half-literate orphan as if he matters? John decides that it is, because the alternative is the rope. Soon the theory becomes practice. John rides along on small jobs, rustling a few cattle under a moonlit sky, serving as lookout while Dutch and Hosea pull low-risk robberies at dusty coach stops. His hands shake the first time he whistles a warning, but when the job goes smooth and Dutch claps him on the shoulder, the fear turns into something else. Thrill, purpose, responsibility. For the first time, the world feels like a place where he has a role beyond victim. Piece by piece, Dutch's rhetoric sinks in so deeply that crime stops feeling like crime at all. If the law tried to hang him, what loyalty does he owe the law? If civilization cast him out, why not rob civilization blind? In John's mind, every pocket picked, every cow driven off a rich man's range, becomes justice against a world that tried to kill him. The old ways were dying, Dutch insists, and they will carve a new one from gunsmoke and belief. John believes. Completely, John believes. Completely, but before John ever rode under Dutch's banner, there was another boy who had already given Dutch that same blind faith, and paid for it in quieter, deeper ways. Arthur Morgan's story begins earlier, and in the truest sense, it begins with loss. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty outlaw who dragged his son through a hard, drifting childhood until the law finally caught up with him. Arthur watched his father arrested and hauled off in irons, the promise of a hanging or a cell waiting at the end of the road. That should have been the end of Arthur's story, another unwanted kid abandoned by civilization. Instead, Dutch and Hosea stepped in, taking the teenager under their wing, turning him into the first real proof that Dutch's philosophy of found family could work. From its humble beginnings, that relationship was intense. Dutch taught Arthur to read, to argue, to believe that the world was changing, and that an outlaw could still be a thinking man. Hosea taught him to hunt, to track, to see through a con before it started. Arthur became the dependable right hand, the boy who rode into storms without complaint and came back with money, horses, or blood on his hands if Dutch asked. In camp, he was the living embodiment of Dutch's rhetoric, loyal, disciplined, and utterly committed. So when John Marston arrived, dragged down from a botched hanging as a scrawny 8-year-old, he did not meet a gang in its infancy. He met a machine already humming, with Arthur at its center. Two boys, both rescued from the rope, both branded as criminals before they had a chance to grow up. Yet they stood at different stages of the same journey, Arthur already hardened and sure of his place, John still raw, wide-eyed, and desperate to prove he deserved this new family. Their personalities clashed and complemented in equal measure. Arthur was more reserved and observant, a man who watched a room before speaking, who followed orders and carried burdens without needing praise. John was mouthy, impulsive, quick to argue, and quicker to swing, covering a deep, quiet insecurity. He watched how Dutch spoke to Arthur, how Dutch trusted Arthur, measuring himself against a standard he could never quite reach. Was he the next Arthur? Or always the lesser one? Dutch's behavior sharpened that question. To Arthur, Dutch remained the demanding mentor, the man who relied on him to keep the gang fed, protected, and in line. Arthur was the workhorse, the one sent on the hardest rides. John, though, became a project. Dutch saw a chance to mold a boy into the ideal believer, to refine his philosophy through a second surrogate son who might embody the dream even more perfectly. On the surface, it was brotherhood. Underneath, it was imbalance. One son proven, one son in progress, and a father figure whose ego needed both. That unequal triangle would linger in every shared campfire, every robbery, every whispered doubt when the old ways were dying and the gang began to crack. It would haunt Arthur. It would embitter John. And it would push Dutch toward choices that no one in that makeshift family could ever take back. That imbalance did not stay abstract for long. It played out on dusty streets and rattling train cars, in the small-town banks and stagecoaches that became the gang's proving grounds. From its humble beginnings as a loose band of drifters, the Vander Linde outfit turned those early jobs into a training ground, and Arthur and John were thrown into the center of it. On a bank job in some nameless prairie town, Arthur was the steady hand. He watched the clock, watched the windows, watched Dutch's silhouette in the street. John kicked the doors, shouted at tellers, waved his gun with all the bravado of a boy desperate to prove he was a man. The pattern repeated on stagecoach holdups and train robberies, Arthur placing men, checking ammo, reading the world. John riding too close, firing too early, nearly getting himself killed and somehow turning it into a story. Their partnership became a story of friction and familiarity. Around the campfire, Arthur would needle him, calling him the great John Marston, savior of idiots and enemy of plans, poking at every misstep. John snapped back about Arthur being Dutch's favorite workhorse, the big dependable ox who never said no. On the surface it was mockery, two outlaws trading insults. Underneath there was a grudging respect neither could quite admit. Who else would Arthur trust to watch his back in a gunfight? Who else would John follow into a burning train car? In those years, Arthur was the believer in the truest sense. Dutch's philosophy was his scripture, and every robbery felt like a sermon against civilization, against the rich men in suits who fenced off land and sold freedom back in pieces. John listened to the same speeches, but heard something different. He admired Dutch, even loved him as family, yet he tested the edges of every promise. Why rob this bank if the town was barely scraping by? Why blow a train bridge when the target was just another payroll and not some grand symbol of oppression? Dutch noticed the questions, and he used them. One day he praised Arthur in front of John for being reliable, a man who understood the cause. Another day he clapped John on the shoulder and called him the living embodiment of the gang's future, the spark that would carry their dreams forward when the old ways were dying. Each compliment landed like a quiet challenge to the other man. Neither saw it clearly, not yet. The rivalry stayed half buried beneath laughter and smoke, beneath shared bullets and stolen dollars. As long as the gang was winning, as long as trains fell and banks opened and the world was changing on someone else's terms, those cracks held. But pressure was building at the edges of their freedom, and the next time a plan went wrong, those buried tensions were waiting for a place to break through. And that break was closer than any of them understood. That break did not arrive as a single gunshot or a single betrayal. It arrived as more people, more voices, more dreams crowding around the same campfire, turning a tight circle into a wandering tribe. From its humble beginnings as three outlaws against the world, the Vander Linde gang began to swell. The first waves of new blood changed everything. Bill Williamson came in angry and half-broken, a former soldier whose time in uniform had taught him discipline, but left him with nothing to be loyal to. Javier Escuela followed, a revolutionary and musician in exile, carrying stories of uprisings and lost causes from across the border. Men who, in time, would be hunted by John Marston as enemies were first welcomed as comrades, sharing blankets, bullets, and Dutch's firelit speeches about freedom and civilization. Camp life settled into a rhythm that, for John, felt in the truest sense like a home. In summer, the gang might drift through the heartlands, pitching tents near rivers and rail lines. In winter, they hugged the timber and the hills, living lean off trapped game and stolen coin. There were shared meals around cast iron pots, arguments over coffee, Hosea's quiet card games, and Dutch's booming laughter when a robbery went right. Stolen money bought warm coats, a bottle of decent whiskey, maybe a music box for the women. For a boy who had come from a noose and reform schools, this chaos was the closest thing to stability. But every new arrival shifted the balance. John was no longer the only rescued stray, no longer the singular lost soul Dutch had hauled from death. Dutch called Bill brother, praised Javier's ideals, wrapped the same grand philosophy around them that he once reserved for Arthur and John. The words were familiar, almost rehearsed. How many times could a man promise to save the world before those promises began to sound thin? John felt it most when Dutch's arm landed on another shoulder, when praise for a job well done went elsewhere. He watched Susan Grimshaw enforce Dutch's rules, watched younger runaways appear and be folded into the family with the same language of destiny and purpose. What had once felt unique now felt shared, diluted, even replaceable. So John worked. He rode harder, shot straighter, listened closer. Over the years, he became a reliable gunman, the one trusted to ride flank on a coach robbery or hold a line when bullets started to fly. He learned to move through a fight with cold focus, to track a mark across open country, to read the fear in a man's eyes before the draw. Along the way, that dry, cutting wit began to surface, a hard shell over very real uncertainty. A mocking remark at Bill's temper, a quiet jab at Javier's poetry, humor as armor, and as a way to prove he belonged. Yet beneath the camaraderie and the shared spoils, something sharper was taking root. In a camp this crowded, importance had to be earned and then defended. John's need to matter, to Dutch, to this makeshift family, became its own kind of hunger. It would drive him to take greater risks, to cling to the gang's story of itself long after the cracks were obvious, and to make choices that would echo, years later, when those same men stood on opposite ends of a gun. Because in a world where the old ways were dying, the need to be seen, to be chosen, could be more dangerous than any lawman. That hunger to be chosen did not belong to Arthur alone. It moved through the whole camp, and nowhere was it more volatile, more fragile, than in the figure of Abigail Roberts. Abigail did not arrive as an innocent. From the very beginning, she was a woman who had survived the only way the frontier offered a poor girl with no protection, attaching herself to men who lived outside civilization. She was tough, sharp-tongued, quick to bite back at an insult, and just as quick to laugh with the men around the fire. Underneath that hard edge, though, there was something else. A tiredness, a calculation, and a desperate need for any kind of family that would not simply sell her or leave her to die. In a camp that claimed to be a story of chosen kin, that history made her both welcome and suspect. Abigail slept with several of the gang's outlaws in those early years, including Bill Williamson, and the details of who, when, and why were never as important as the whispers they left behind. Around the fire, the men joked about her, bragged, made crude comments that were half bravado and half insecurity. The women, especially Susan Grimshaw, watched with narrowed eyes, weighing Abigail's presence against the fragile order that kept this roaming caravan from collapsing into a brothel and a brawl. Those early relationships created invisible lines across the camp. Bill nursed a wounded pride he covered with bluster and drink. Others resented the way Abigail could move between bedrolls and conversations, turning her own survival into a kind of currency. Dutch and Hosea tolerated it, even shrugged at it, because in their philosophy the gang was a refuge for every lost soul the world cast aside. But the jokes, the side glances, the muttered comments when Abigail walked past, those never really went away. Into that tangle stepped John Marston. He was young, scarred by reform schools and hangings, trying to prove he was more than a stray Dutch had pulled from a noose. Abigail and John found each other in the middle of that chaos, two people who had been used and abandoned so many times that tenderness felt dangerous. They flirted with sarcasm instead of honesty, traded barbs instead of confessions. Was it any surprise that when they finally reached for something real, it came wrapped in bravado and denial? John knew Abigail's past. He heard Bill's jokes, the snide remarks from Javier, the offhand comments that reduced her to a camp story rather than a woman. That knowledge dug under his skin. It fed an insecurity he never shook, the fear that he was only another name on a long list, another stop on Abigail's road to survival. His love for her, in the truest sense, became tangled with possessiveness, with a need to claim something in a world that had claimed everything from him. Yet John was also the man who ran. When the pressure grew, when Dutch's plans turned bloody or the law closed in, his instinct was to disappear, to chase freedom over responsibility. How could a man who feared abandonment and betrayal so deeply also be the one who vanished for a year, leaving Abigail and their infant son behind? That contradiction would haunt them both. Their bond was real. Their arguments were real. So was the child who came from that Union Jack, the living embodiment of all their hopes that the old ways were dying and that a different future might be possible. But this was a story of love built on shaky ground, genuine affection laid over layers of shame, jealousy, and unspoken resentment. In a world that was changing faster than any outlaw camp could understand, that foundation would not stay hidden forever. It would crack under gunfire, under Dutch's delusions, and under the quiet, relentless question that hung over every stolen moment of peace. How long could something this fragile survive? The fracture inside John deepened at the very moment something new entered his world. A child who had never chosen any of this. Jack Marston was not born in a house or a town, but in a clearing ringed by wagons and rifles. His first home, a camp that moved with the seasons and slept with one eye open. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had called itself a family. Jack was the proof made flesh, the living embodiment of that claim swaddled in a threadbare blanket. His first lullabies were the sounds of drunken laughter, Hosea's low stories by the fire, and the distant crack of gunfire echoing off the hills. One week he woke under snow-heavy pines, the next under dripping Spanish moss, the world reduced to canvas tents, smoky lanterns, and the constant shuffle of horses that never stayed tied for long. John's reaction to fatherhood was not simple joy. It was pride and terror and denial tangled together. He wanted to be better than the father who had abandoned him, better than the drunk who had left him to a reform school and a rope. But what did better even mean for an outlaw riding from county to county, living on robbery and Dutch's philosophy of freedom over civilization? He could cradle his son in his arms. He could not imagine a future that was not running. Around Jack, the gang revealed its many faces. Some doted on him. Hosea bounced him on his knee and muttered that maybe this was their chance to stop before the old ways were dying completely. Abigail guarded him with a ferocity that made even Bill think twice. Others treated him as a nuisance, a crying reminder that the camp was no longer just hard men and easy dreams. Dutch, ever the orator, framed the boy as proof that their family was real and self-sustaining, a story of outlaws who could raise children better than the cold institutions of civilization ever had. John wanted to believe that. He had to. Yet every time the Pinkertons were mentioned, every time the gang rode out and left Abigail clutching Jack in the wagon's shadow, another crack formed. He wanted safety and stability for his son, but his loyalty was chained to Dutch's promise that their roaming camp could somehow offer both freedom and security, gunsmoke and innocence in the same breath. Was that vision idealistic, or already a delusion? One night, under a bruised purple sky, John sat with Jack near the campfire while the others argued over routes and scores. The flames threw long shadows, turning Dutch and Hosea into wavering giants at the edge of the light. Jack slept against his chest, tiny fingers curled into John's coat, unaware that the world was changing around him. John stared into the fire and silently asked a question he was not yet brave enough to answer. Was this the life his son would inherit, or the curse he had to break? The answer, when it finally came, would tear everything apart. John's answer did not come in a speech from Dutch or a blessing from Hosea. It came in the quiet. In the long nights when Jack cried and Abigail snapped and the camp closed in around him like a noose. The fire promised warmth, but all John could feel was heat and pressure. In the truest sense, he began to fear not death, but inheritance. He knew what it meant to be a son of a drunk and a whore, to be abandoned to reform school and the hangman's rope. Dutch had cut him down from that rope, from its humble beginnings a rescue that felt like salvation. Now John looked at Jack and saw his father's shadow in his own hands. Was he just passing on the curse? Dutch called the gang family, called their way of life freedom, but John watched the guns on the table, the whiskey on Dutch's breath, the arguments over money, and wondered if this was a story of protection or a story of repetition. Responsibility suffocated him. Abigail's anger when he rode out too long, Dutch's expectations when he rode back, Hosea's quiet disappointment when he shrugged off another chore. The camp praised him as Dutch's golden boy, the living embodiment of the gang's future, yet every word of praise felt heavier than a bullet. Raising a child in an outlaw camp was Dutch's proud experiment, proof that their philosophy could sustain a family. John was never truly convinced, so one day, he was simply gone. No note, no grand farewell, no speech about dreams or destiny, just an empty bedroll, a missing horse, and a trail that faded after a few miles. He rode toward nothing in particular, chasing vague notions of honest work, or at least a world where Dutch's voice did not echo in every decision. If civilization was closing in, perhaps there was a place at its edge where an outlaw could pretend to be a ranch hand, a laborer, a man without a past. The outside world answered harshly. John tried his hand at ranch work, at hauling, at any job that would pay in coin instead of blood. But the scars on his face, the way he watched doors and windows, the rumors that followed a man who rode too well and shot too straight, these marked him. To the people he met, he was never just a worker. He was a threat. Meanwhile, the gang absorbed the wound and let it fester. Abigail was furious, her hurt sharpening every word. She had given herself to this family and to John, and he had ridden off when Jack needed him most. Arthur was disgusted. To him, John's departure was cowardice dressed up as confusion, betrayal wrapped in excuses. Dutch, stung where his pride was most fragile, turned John's absence into a sermon. He spoke of loyalty and abandonment, of sons who did not understand sacrifice, of how the old ways were dying because men no longer believed in anything but themselves. Here, the pattern broke. For the first time, Dutch's favorite had walked away, and the gang learned a dangerous lesson. Even family could leave. Months bled into nearly a year. John drifted from job to job, never staying, never belonging. The more civilization pressed in, the more he realized how little space it had for a lost soul with an outlaw's history. Men laughed with him in saloons, then went silent when his name slipped out. Foremen underpaid him, then hinted he should move on before questions were asked. The world was changing, but not in a way that offered him redemption. Freedom, out here, meant isolation. In the end, the only place that had ever truly taken him in was the camp he had fled. So he turned back, not with triumph, but with a kind of weary hope. He imagined Abigail's anger softening, Jack running to him, Dutch clapping a hand on his shoulder and welcoming his prodigal son home. What he found instead was a camp that had learned to live without him. New routines, new jokes, new scars. Abigail's eyes were colder, Jack more used to Arthur's lap than his own. Arthur kept his distance, his every glance a reminder of judgment not yet spoken. And Dutch, though he smiled and spoke warmly, carried a new distance in his gaze, a calculation that had never been there before. John had left for a year. Dutch would never truly let him forget it. From that moment on, no matter what John did, there would always be a question hanging in the air. When the world closed in again, would he run? That unspoken doubt, more than any bullet or bounty poster, poisoned their bond. It turned every promise into a test, every plan into a measure of loyalty. And in a gang built on trust and shared delusions of freedom, that fracture would echo through every decision to come. That fracture does not heal when John rides back into camp. It just changes shape. His homecoming is not a triumphant return of the prodigal son. It is a story of relief poisoned by resentment, of family reunited and quietly breaking apart in the same breath. Abigail is the first to make that clear. She is relieved that Jack's father is alive, that the boy who has been asking where his pa went can finally point at a real man and not a fading memory. But beneath that relief there is rage, old and sharp. She has spent a year raising their child in a world of gunfire and bounties, surrounded by outlaws who talk about freedom while leaving her to carry the cost. Every time John tries to joke, to smooth things over, she reminds him who stayed and who ran. Her words are not subtle. Her eyes are worse. Arthur's reaction is colder, quieter, and in the truest sense more dangerous. From the very beginning, Arthur has watched John as the younger rival, the other son Dutch lifted out of the mud. When John disappears, Arthur calls it what he believes it is, betrayal. So when John limps back into the fold, scarred and apologetic, Arthur does not offer forgiveness. He offers sarcasm. Every jab about John's timing, every dismissive remark about his commitment is a verdict. To Arthur, John only cares when it is convenient, and that belief will stain every shared ride and every whispered argument in 1899. Dutch, meanwhile, turns his hurt into philosophy. He welcomes John back with speeches about family, about loyalty, about how a man can lose his way but never truly leave the cause. Yet behind the grand gestures, his ego is wounded. John was supposed to be the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals, the proof that a lost soul could be remade through faith in the gang. Instead, he vanished without a word. Dutch frames it as betrayal of the family, and though he smiles, a crack has opened in his vision of John as the perfect disciple. Cracks spread. John feels all of this pressing on him. Guilt becomes his shadow. To make up for that missing year, he throws himself into danger with reckless enthusiasm, volunteering for difficult jobs, charging ahead in gunfights, trying to prove that he belongs. It is overcompensation in its purest form. Each risk is a plea, trust me again. Yet he can sense that something has shifted, that the easy camaraderie of the past has been replaced by watchful eyes and measured silences. That missing year becomes the invisible fault line under every conversation, every plan, every accusation, when Dutch later rages in 1899 that John has betrayed him again. That supposed betrayal does not start on a cliff at Beaver Hollow or in the shadow of a collapsing dream. It starts here, in this fractured homecoming, when the old ways were dying and no one in the gang could admit it. And the next time the world closes in, the question that once hung unspoken over John will not be so easy to ignore. The next time the world closes in, it does not come as a single posse on the horizon. It comes as rails, wires, and laws stretching across the continent, turning open country into a mapped and measured grid. By 1899, the world was changing faster than any campfire story could keep up with, and the Van der Linde gang is suddenly living on borrowed time. Railroads now crisscross the frontier, iron veins feeding cities with people, money, and soldiers. Telegraph lines hang over the plains like spiderwebs, carrying messages in minutes where riders once took days. Bank vaults are stronger, records are better, and the federal government is no longer a distant rumor, but an organized presence with courts, marshals, and budgets devoted to hunting down the last great outlaws. The old ways were dying, not in theory, but in timetables and ledgers. Into this tightening net step the Pinkertons. Once hired guns for railroads and corporations, they have become the living embodiment of industrial civilization's long arm. They have files, photographs, paid informants, and, most importantly, instant communication. A robbery in one state can be reported across 3 territories before the gang has even split the take. Romantic images of the noble outlaw give way to wanted posters and federal mandates. Men like Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross are not chasing legends. They are cleaning up a list. Yet Dutch refuses to see it. His philosophy, forged from its humble beginnings in the 1870s, has not evolved with the world that now surrounds him. He still preaches freedom from government, from banks, from the creeping fences of civilization, insisting that with enough cleverness and enough nerve, the gang can always stay one step ahead. To Dutch, the problem is never the plan, only the loyalty of the people following it. How can a man who survived bounty hunters on horseback accept that a telegraph operator can undo him with a single sentence? For John Marston, this new era becomes a quiet nightmare. He is an outlaw raised on Dutch's promises, a story of family and rebellion told around the fire until it felt, in the truest sense, like truth. But every train that roars past, every telegraph office in every growing town, is a reminder that those dreams now demand catastrophic violence to sustain. To keep living free, the gang must hit bigger targets, take greater risks, leave more bodies. Is that freedom, or just another kind of prison? John stands at the crossroads of 2 dying things, the frontier and Dutch's dream. He still owes loyalty to the man who pulled him from a rope, yet he can see, more clearly than Dutch will ever admit, that the world has outgrown stagecoach holdups and half-mad speeches about equality. The gang's refusal to adapt turns every job into a gamble against an enemy that no longer sleeps. All of this pressure, all of this denial, converges on one decision. Blackwater, a modern town on a modern lake, full of money, law, and eyes. Dutch swears it will be the score that buys their freedom forever. In truth, it will expose just how outdated his methods have become, and how high the cost of clinging to a dying philosophy will be for John Marston and everyone who still believes in him. Dutch promises that Blackwater will be the last great job, the score that buys land, safety, and true freedom. In his mind, it is the culmination of everything the gang has ever stood for. A story of idealistic outlaws taking one final stand against civilization before disappearing into their own private paradise. The plan is ambitious, almost delusional. Dutch has his eye on a modern ferry carrying government bonds, rumor says, or perhaps a bank tied to that ferry's arrival. Different survivors remember different details, which is fitting for a moment born in confusion. What is clear is the intention. Hit the boat. Hit the money. Strike at the heart of a modern town that prides itself on order, progress, and law. In Dutch's rhetoric, Blackwater is the living embodiment of everything he claims to hate. John is there for that dream, for that promise that this will be the job that ends the running. He rides in as a trusted gun, a man who has bled for Dutch from its humble beginnings. When the gang was just a handful of misfits, to this polished lakeside town. But once the robbery starts, nothing goes to plan. Shots ring out where there should have been silence. The law responds faster than expected. A simple smash and grab becomes a running gunfight through streets that were supposed to be their gateway to a better world. Bodies fall. Civilians scream. The ferry, the docks, the alleys of Blackwater blur into one chaotic tableau of smoke and blood. For John, this is not philosophy anymore. It is survival. He is part of a plan spiraling out of control. Watching townsfolk and lawmen die in the crossfire of a dream that was sold as noble rebellion. The gang scrambles, dragging wounded, abandoning money, leaving friends behind. The old ways were dying, and Blackwater proves it in the truest sense. In the middle of that chaos comes the moment that truly breaks the spell. Dutch, cornered and panicking, takes an innocent woman hostage. She is not a robber, not a Pinkerton, not an enemy of his imagined revolution. She is just in the wrong place at the wrong time. When she becomes inconvenient, Dutch shoots her. For Arthur, for John, for anyone who believed the gang did not hurt the innocent, that single shot is a revelation. Dutch's code, his carefully crafted philosophy, shatters. What is left behind looks less like a leader and more like a desperate man. Blackwater gives the Pinkertons exactly what they need. A blood-soaked excuse to hunt the gang without restraint. Dozens dead, a ferry ruined, a town traumatized. Dutch insists it was a trap, that betrayal and conspiracy explain everything, but the truth is simpler and harsher. His ambition outgrew his judgment. His fear overpowered his ideals. From that moment, the Van der Linde gang is not just wanted, it is doomed. The survivors flee north, riding hard into the storm-torn mountains. Snow closes around them, turning the world white and merciless. Horses stumble, men vanish in the blizzard, and in the confusion John is separated from the group, swallowed by the cold. For days, no one knows whether Dutch's golden boy is dead, captured, or simply gone. When he finally reappears, half frozen and torn by wolves, it will not just be a rescue. It will be the first sign that the family Dutch built from the very beginning is breaking apart, and that the next campfire will burn with suspicion, guilt, and the first quiet whispers of betrayal. The storm does the talking first. Howling wind, white air, and a world narrowed to a few blind steps at a time. Somewhere in that blizzard, the gang's future staggers off alone, and the snow begins to write a story of scars that will never heal. John's separation after Blackwater is not heroic. It is stupid, desperate, and very human. He rides out into the grizzlies to prove something, to show Dutch and Arthur that the boy who ran off for a year is still an outlaw worth betting on. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and John Marston refuses to be the weak link. Then the trail vanishes, the wind turns, and the mountains swallow him whole. Wolves find him before his family does. Teeth in the dark, fur and blood, and the shock of realizing that all the speeches about freedom and destiny mean nothing when the cold is chewing through bone. The attack tears into his face, rips at his side, and brands him in the truest sense. Those jagged scars that define him in Red Dead Redemption are not just wounds, they are a verdict, a reminder that nature and fate both bite. By the time Arthur and Javier track him down, John is half buried in snow, half dead, half conscious, and wholly humiliated. Arthur has to lean off his horse, grab him, and drag him back through the blizzard, step by brutal step. It is a mirror held up to the past. Years earlier, Dutch pulled a no-name orphan from a hanging tree and gave him a philosophy, a family, and a purpose. Now Dutch's first son hauls Dutch's golden boy out of the ice, the living embodiment of a pattern John will never quite escape. He is always the one being saved, never the one doing the saving. Back in Coulter, the rescue does not wash him clean. It stains him differently. Some in camp laugh at his recklessness, at the way the wolves rearranged his face. Others, quieter, trade glances that ask a harder question. Can this man be trusted when it counts? The gang is starving, freezing, hunted, and John has just proven that one man's pride can endanger everyone. Dutch seizes the moment. In front of the fire, in front of everyone, he scolds John for riding off alone, for forcing Arthur to risk his life. Then, with that familiar theatrical warmth, he forgives him. He calls him son, praises his toughness, turns the whole near death into a lesson about loyalty and survival from its humble beginnings to this frozen hell. John hears the applause, but feels the knife. He is injured, sidelined, and once again reduced to the boy who disappeared when Abigail was pregnant. The boy who made Dutch feel abandoned. Every bandage, every sideways glance, every muttered joke about wolves and wanderers presses the same bruise. His worth is conditional. His failures are permanent. So he lies there in the dim light of Coulter, jaw clenched, listening. This is a family that remembers everything, forgives nothing, and files every mistake away for later use. He understands the message beneath the speeches. In this world, every scar is a debt, and one day someone will come to collect. Morning at Horseshoe Overlook feels almost merciful. The snow and howling wind of Coulter give way to soft grass, birdsong, and a wide view over the town of Valentine, as if the world itself is offering the gang a second chance. From its humble beginnings in the mountains, this new camp looks, at a glance, like progress. They pitch tents on the bluff, hang lanterns, and drag crates into neat rows. There is a rhythm again, Pearson's stew pot bubbling, Tilly and Mary Beth chatting over laundry, Hosea scheming about stagecoaches and cattlemen drifting through Valentine. Dutch calls it a fresh start, a story of survival and reinvention, insisting that civilization has not beaten them yet. There are banks to scout, trains to watch, pockets to pick. The old ways were dying, but he swears the gang can still outrun history. For John, the thaw is more than weather. It is an opportunity to prove that Coulter was not the end of his usefulness. He takes the smaller jobs first, riding with Strauss to collect debts. Shaking down farmers and shopkeepers who look a little too much him in the mirror, men trapped between hunger and obligation. He helps with camp chores, hauls firewood, mends fences, and volunteers for guard duty. Anything to show he is more than the half-frozen joke dragged off a cliff. Yet every task is also a test. When John returns with a ledger balanced or a debtor properly frightened, Dutch claps him on the shoulder, praising his loyalty and calling him son in front of the others. Then, in quieter moments, he reminds John of the year he disappeared, of Abigail left behind, of Jack born into uncertainty. Praise followed by a sting, affection braided with accusation. Dutch keeps him slightly off balance, the living embodiment of conditional love. Abigail feels that imbalance too. In camp, she pushes John to be present, to sit with Jack, to tell the boy stories that do not end in gunfire. John tries. He shows Jack how to hold a fishing pole, how to sit a horse, how to watch the sky for weather. There are genuine smiles, small moments of tenderness that almost resemble a normal family. But how normal can a family be when surrounded by wanted posters? Arguments cut through those quiet scenes. Abigail demands safety. John insists that the outlaw life is all he knows, that Dutch's philosophy still promises some twisted form of freedom. She reminds him that disappearing once nearly broke her, that Jack deserves more than campfires and gunshots in the distance. He fires back that he is trying, that every ride into Valentine, every chore, every risk is for them. Both are right, and both are trapped. In Valentine itself, the illusion of normalcy deepens. The gang drinks in the saloon, brawls in the mud, laughs as if the past can be washed off with whiskey and river water. Arthur hauls John out of a bar fight, Bill boasts, Javier plays guitar under the stars. It is, in the truest sense, borrowed time. Because even as they swagger through town, Pinkerton eyes are already studying their faces, noting their routines, turning this brief piece into evidence. The world was changing, and somewhere beyond the lantern light, men with badges and ledgers are closing the distance, one quiet report at a time. The first real knock on the door does not come from a rival gang or a bounty hunter with a poster. It comes in the form of two men in suits, clean-shaven, calm, and utterly sure of themselves. Agents Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross are not just lawmen. They are the living embodiment of a new order, a reminder that the world was changing, and that the old ways were dying whether the Van der Linde gang accepted it or not. They do not charge through the trees with guns blazing. They stroll into the gang's orbit, at Horseshoe Overlook, and again at Clemens Point, with files under their arms and names on their tongues. Milton speaks with the patience of a man holding all the cards, offering Dutch a chance to surrender, to hand over the guilty ones and walk away. Ross watches, silent, already measuring faces for future leverage. This is not a story of posses and torches. This is a story of ledgers, reports, and quiet conversations in government offices far from the mud of camp. From its humble beginnings, the gang survived by staying one step ahead of local sheriffs and greedy ranchers. Now, the enemy is national, coordinated, and in the truest sense, organized. The Pinkertons track bank withdrawals, telegraph messages, and witness statements. They know about Blackwater. They know about St. Denis. They know the gang's routes, their aliases, even who tends the horses. Running still works, for a while, but every new camp is just another entry in a growing file. Dutch hears Milton's offer and treats it as an insult. To him, negotiation is surrender, and surrender is a betrayal of everything he has preached since the very beginning. He doubles down on his philosophy, insisting that they can outthink the government, outfight the Pinkertons, outmaneuver a civilization built on fences and rules. Each new threat only sharpens his rhetoric. More speeches about freedom, more grand plans, more promises that one last score will buy their escape from this tightening noose. John, standing in the background, sees something different. He sees his name on Milton's lips. He sees the way Ross glances at Abigail and Jack when the agents mention families and consequences. For the first time, the law is not faceless. It knows his history, his reform school records, the hanging Dutch and Hosea interrupted when he was barely 8. It knows that his greatest strength is also his greatest weakness, his loyalty to his family. The irony is quiet but brutal. Dutch believes the gang can never be tamed. Milton and Ross already understand exactly how to tame John Marston. They do not need to kill him. They only need to wait, to let his love for Abigail and Jack ripen into a weapon. The leverage is there, written in those files, hanging in the air every time Milton smiles. The trigger has not been pulled yet, but the gun is already pointed, and the next time the government comes calling, it will not be with offers. The gun is already pointed when the gang rides into Rhodes. The threat is distant, abstract, wrapped in government paper, but the world was changing, and the next chapter of this story would not be written in snow or mud. It would be written under painted porches and plantation roofs, where men in waistcoats smile as they sharpen the knife. Clemens Point brings the gang to the edge of Southern civilization, in the truest sense. Dutch decides that if they cannot outrun the law, they will outplay it, embedding themselves in the genteel rot of Rhodes. The Van der Linde gang becomes an invisible hand in a local feud between the Braithwaites and the Greys, two wealthy families whose manners are polished and whose souls are blackened. They pour drinks, host parties, speak of honor and tradition, then hire outlaws to bleed each other dry. For John, this is a different battlefield. He stands on Braithwaite's steps in a stiff shirt and tie, a reluctant ornament in Dutch's performance. He can ride into a hail of bullets without flinching, but a drawing room full of planters and sheriffs makes him itch. Dutch calls it strategy, philosophy made practical. Use their greed, their pride, their delusions of superiority. John only sees that these respectable men are as corrupt as any outlaw, only better dressed. If civilization looks like this, what exactly is Dutch trying to join? The deeper the gang wades into Rhodes, the clearer the betrayal beneath the courtesy becomes. Sean dies in the street under a gray ambush. Jack is taken from the camp under a Braithwaite flag. Dutch still talks about loyalty and freedom, still insists they can turn these rivalries into one last score, but John watches the dream fray. This is a story of masks and mirrors, of an idealistic philosophy crashing against the reality of old money and new power. Then the pattern breaks. Rhodes is small. St. Denis is not. Riding into St. Denis is like riding into another world. Electric lights burn away the night. Streetcars rattle past factories and crowded alleys. Smokestacks, telegraph wires, bridges of iron and stone, the living embodiment of a future that has no place for outlaws on horseback. John, who once thought Blackwater was overwhelming, now feels genuinely small, a relic from its humble beginnings of campfires and trail dust. Dutch, however, is entranced. Here, he sees endless possibilities: banks, trams, political dinners, foreign investors. He talks about disappearing into the crowd, about turning civilization's own machinery against it. John hears only noise. How can a man who cannot even keep his family together hope to outwit an entire city? St. Denis exposes the final contradiction. Dutch believes he can bend this modern world to his will. John senses that the old ways were dying, and that their way of life is already a ghost. One day, these same streets, these same telegraph wires, will carry the orders that send John Marston hunting Bill, Javier, and Dutch himself. The stage is being built around him. He just does not know yet that he will be the last actor left standing on it. John feels that stage closing in with every new camp, every new promise that sounds more desperate than the last. The Blackwater Ferry is supposed to be the big one, the job that sets the gang up for life, but it ends in chaos, dead civilians, Pinkertons, and a retreat into the blizzard. From its humble beginnings, this was meant to be a story of freedom and family. Now it is a story of running. At Coulter, Dutch tells them the world was changing, that civilization is pressing in, and that one more score will buy them a place beyond its reach. The train job for Leviticus Cornwall goes wrong, the body count rises, and the Pinkertons close in faster than expected. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, it is the same pattern in a different landscape. A bank in Valentine, the Rhodes feud, Sean shot in the street, Jack kidnapped. Each disaster is folded into a sermon. Each failure becomes proof that the next plan must work. John listens, but he no longer hears the living embodiment of an idealistic philosophy. He hears a man trying to convince himself. Late at night, away from the firelight where Dutch performs, John sits with Abigail and speaks the doubts he cannot risk airing in front of the others. How many dead for this dream? How many times can a man promise one last score before the words turn to smoke? Abigail, who has seen Dutch woo and abandon more than one lost soul, pushes him to think of Jack. She reminds him that the gang is not just a banner of loyalty, it is also a moving target for every lawman and bounty hunter in the West. John starts to imagine a different world, a small ranch, honest work, a life where his son does not learn to reload before he can read. In the truest sense, that fantasy is more radical than any speech Dutch ever gave. Arthur's disillusionment comes slower. He still clings to the memory of Dutch from the very beginning, the man who taught him to read and to question. John has already tested the edges of that myth. His year-long disappearance before 1899, the cold reception when he returned half dead from the wolves, the way Dutch withheld warmth as punishment for disloyalty, all of it cracked the idol early. So when John starts to push back, it is cautious but real, a quiet question about whether Cornwall will ever stop hunting them, a suggestion that Saint Denis feels too big, too modern, for their brand of outlaw theater. Dutch meets these challenges with irritation, with reminders of the rope he cut when John was 8, with guilt about how much he has given this boy he raised. Loyalty becomes a chain rather than a choice. By the time Saint Denis burns them, by the time Hosea and Lenny fall, and Dutch talks about Tahiti as if it were salvation, John finally understands the shape of the noose. The man who once saved him from hanging is now leading him, and his son toward a slower, quieter execution. The only question left is whether John will step off the gallows willingly, or jump. Guarma is where the dream goes silent, cut off from America, from the Pinkertons, from the familiar rhythm of camps and wagons. The gang is reduced to what it really is, a handful of exhausted outlaws stranded on a foreign shore, trying to pretend Dutch still has a plan. For John, Guarma begins in absence. While Arthur, Dutch, and the others are shipwrecked and dragged into a local revolution, John is not with them. He is left behind in Sisika, rotting in a prison yard where the sun never seems to move. That separation matters. For the first time since the very beginning, Dutch's voice is not the constant weather of his world. No grand speeches. No philosophy about freedom and civilization. Just walls, chains, and the memory of a woman and a boy waiting on the other side of the bars. When Arthur finally drags John out of Sisika, John is thinner, paler, angrier. The rescue is daring, but the cost is written across his body. Bruises, scars, the limp that will haunt him. Every time he follows Dutch, he comes back more broken than before. Guarma, in the truest sense, is not just a detour on a map. It is a detour in John's soul. A brutal reminder that Dutch's plans always seem to end with John bleeding on the ground while someone else talks about a better tomorrow. On Guarma itself, the parallel is cruelly neat. Dutch inserts the gang into a local conflict between a plantation tyrant and revolutionaries fighting for their land. He speaks to these strangers with the same idealistic fire he once used on John and Arthur, dressing up gunfights as justice and chaos as liberation. Yet John, watching from the edge of the campfires, sees something different. He sees a story of men used as tools, of promises made to the desperate, of loyalty demanded but never repaid. The island's revolution mirrors the rebellion growing quietly inside him. From its humble beginnings, John's life with the gang had been sold as family, as salvation for a lost soul. Now, stranded in a jungle that is not his own, he finally has the distance to ask a dangerous question. Whose freedom has all this blood really been buying? Dutch's? The gang's? Or just the fading ego of a man who cannot admit the world was changing and the old ways were dying? By the time the survivors stagger back from Guarma and reunite with what remains of the gang, something fundamental has shifted. John has seen a future version of himself in those island fighters, loyal, expendable, buried in someone else's dream. He does not yet know the full cost of walking away, does not yet see the barn doors at Beecher's Hope, but the path toward that choice is suddenly closer, clearer, and far more inevitable than Dutch will ever admit. That realization on Guarma does not vanish when the gang's boots touch American soil again. It lingers, a quiet infection, and it finds its sharpest echo in the changing bond between Arthur Morgan and John Marston. From the very beginning of 1899, Arthur treats John as a wayward younger brother, mocking him for running off, for getting himself shot, for failing Abigail and Jack. Their banter is barbed, their loyalty real, but buried under pride and resentment. Arthur is Dutch's first son, John the golden heir who disappeared for a year. That history hangs between them like smoke that refuses to clear. Then Arthur starts coughing. At first it is a nuisance, an irritation he can push through with whiskey and stubbornness, but as tuberculosis tightens its grip, the world is changing for him in a different way. The old ways were dying not just out there in civilization, but inside his own chest. As his body weakens, his perspective sharpens. The jokes at John's expense soften into concern. The impatience becomes something closer to regret. Key missions turn that shift into action. In Horseman Apocalypses, as the Pinkertons raid Beaver Hollow, Arthur and John ride side by side through the chaos, not as rivals competing for Dutch's approval, but as men desperately trying to hold together what remains of their family. Later, in My Last Boy and Our Best Selves, they share more than bullets and saddle time. They share doubts. Dutch's plans sound grand, but feel hollow. The philosophy that once promised freedom now smells of delusions and betrayal. On the ride to the St. Denis train robbery, Arthur quietly pushes John to think beyond the gang. What if there is a ranch, a piece of land, a place where Jack can grow up without a gun in his hand? John listens, torn. This gang is the only home he has ever known, from its humble beginnings when Dutch and Hosea cut him down from a rope and called him son. Walking away feels like betraying that mercy. Their most intimate conversations come in the mud and moonlight of Beaver Hollow. Arthur, gaunt and pale, urges John to leave with Abigail and Jack, to stop chasing Dutch's dream and start building his own. John argues, not because he disagrees, but because he is drowning in guilt. How can an outlaw who abandoned his family once claim to protect them now? How can he turn his back on the men who raised him? In those moments, Arthur sees the truth in the truest sense. His own story is nearly over. John's might still be written. John becomes the living embodiment of everything Arthur once hoped to be, a man who could step out of the shadows and into a life that is not paid for in blood. So Arthur makes an unspoken decision. If someone is going to get out of this alive, it has to be John. If the gang's dreams are ever to mean anything, John must carry them into a different world. And Arthur is willing to pay for that with his own life. The only question now is how high that price will be, and who will try to stop him from paying it. So Arthur turns that decision into motion. From this moment on, every step he takes is aimed at pushing John toward a life beyond the gang, beyond Dutch, beyond the collapsing dream that once promised freedom and family in the truest sense. He starts with the most practical thing an outlaw can offer: money. Robberies that might once have fed the camp now become quiet preparations for John's escape, with Arthur insisting on securing enough cash for land, tools, and a future. He rides with John into danger, not to chase Dutch's grand philosophy, but to carve out a narrow path toward Beecher's Hope before that ranch even has a name. Each job, each risk, is less a heist and more an investment in a story of survival that does not end in a noose. At the same time, Arthur works to clear the human obstacles. He stands between John and Dutch's manipulation, questions the wisdom of new plans, and challenges the gang's blind loyalty. In camp, he tells John to leave, to take Abigail and Jack, to run while there is still time. On the surface, it is just advice. Underneath, it is a command. Dutch once dragged boys into this world. Arthur is now trying to drag a man out of it. Then the world comes crashing down. The Pinkertons close in, Beaver Hollow erupts into chaos, and the old ways were dying in gunsmoke and screaming horses. In the confusion, Arthur does exactly what he has been preparing to do. He buys John time. He fights through the collapsing camp, covering John's retreat, shoving him toward the tunnels, toward the horses, toward Abigail and Jack. All those quiet conversations about getting out are suddenly no longer theories. They are bullets, blood, and hard choices. The escape fractures into something more personal on that final mountain. Arthur and John are separated, and Arthur's last climb becomes a reckoning. He confronts Micah, the living embodiment of the gang's rot, and Dutch, the man who once saved lost souls and now abandons them. Beaten, dying, Arthur uses his final strength not for revenge, but for clarity. He begs Dutch to see what he has become, to understand that Micah is poison, that the dream is gone. It is a plea for Dutch's soul, but indirectly it is also a plea for John's future. For John, the realization comes in fragments. Confusion as Arthur shoves him away, fear as the gunfire fades behind him, then the dawning, terrible understanding that Arthur stayed behind so he could ride forward. How does a man repay a debt written in another man's last breath? Arthur's death is not only the end of one outlaw's road, it is the hinge on which John's entire life swings. From that ridge, John's path bends away from being Dutch's son toward becoming Abigail's husband, Jack's father, a rancher standing between his family and a civilization closing in. The question is whether the world will ever let him keep what Arthur died to give him. Arthur's death bends John's path, but it is Abigail who fixes its direction. If Arthur is the dying man's warning, Abigail is the living embodiment of consequence, the one person who will no longer let John drift between worlds. Her breaking point does not arrive in a single argument. It is years in the making, a story of promises made around campfires and broken on blood-soaked streets. She remembers Blackwater, the ferry job that was supposed to be the last big score, the one that would buy real freedom and a home, and instead left them fleeing through snow with Pinkertons at their heels. She remembers Rhodes, where Dutch's feud with the Greys and Braithwaites ended with Jack torn from her arms, a child used as leverage in a war between decaying Southern aristocrats and an idealistic outlaw philosophy that could not protect its own. She watches John limp back from near death after the wolves in the snow, watches him ride out again because Dutch says there is one more train, one more bank, one more miracle. Each time, Jack stares at the camp entrance, waiting. Each time, the world was changing a little faster, and the old ways were dying a little harder. By the time the gang scatters and the smoke of Beaver Hollow clears, Abigail has seen enough. Dutch's plans have nearly killed her son more than once, and the gang that once felt from its humble beginnings like a rough-edged family now looks to her like a machine that grinds men down and calls the dust freedom. When John talks about going back, about finding Dutch or Bill or Javier, she does not argue philosophy. She sets terms. The ultimatum is simple, and in the truest sense, merciless. Leave this life for good. Build something real with her and Jack. A ranch, a wage, even honest work under a civilization that despises him, if that is what it takes. Or lose them forever. No more second chances, no more disappearing for a year while the gang raises Jack. No more choosing Dutch's dreams over Jack's safety. For John, it rips open a wound that goes back to the very beginning. Dutch and Hosea pulled him from a hanging when he was barely a boy. They taught him to read, to shoot, to steal, to believe he was more than a lost soul destined for a rope. How does a man turn his back on the people who saved him? How does he refuse the man he once called father? Arthur's sacrifice gives him the answer. Arthur did not die so John could ride back to Dutch. He died telling John to be better, to get out, to protect Abigail and Jack from the fate that consumed the gang. Honoring that last wish feels less like betrayal and more like the only loyalty that still means anything. So John chooses. He chooses Abigail. He chooses Jack. He steps away from Dutch's shadow for the first time, believing he is walking toward a quiet life. Instead, he is walking into the sights of a government that has been watching, waiting, and taking notes on every outlaw who dares to dream of becoming a farmer. John's escape from the gang is not freedom. It is probation. He steps into a world that has no interest in his redemption, a world where an ex-outlaw with a scarred face is good for one thing: hard labor that no one else wants. From its humble beginnings, John's new life is a story of humiliation, exhaustion, and the quiet rage of a man who promised his family a home and instead delivers bunkhouses and foreman's insults. He works ranch to ranch, taking any job that keeps Abigail and Jack fed, branding cattle that are not his, shoveling manure while men who never stared down a gun barrel call him boy in hand and remind him that he can be replaced by morning. Every paycheck is small, every dismissal sudden, and each failure cuts deeper than any bullet. How can a man who robbed banks across states not even hold a fence-mending job? The irony hangs over him like storm clouds. The turning point comes when stubborn hope finally outweighs shame. With Sadie Adler's help and a bank clerk's suspicious glare, John signs his name to a deed he can barely afford, a scrubby, wind-blasted patch of land called Beecher's Hope. It is not the paradise Dutch once promised. It is a broken fence, a leaning shack, and a pile of debt. But in John's mind, it is the living embodiment of a promise made to Arthur, to Abigail, to the boy who watched men die for dreams and decided to build one with his own hands. He hammers, hauls, and curses his way toward that dream. Planks go up crooked, nails bend, tools break. Friends drift in to help, not as outlaws planning a robbery, but as workers raising walls. It is, in the truest sense, the opposite of a gang camp. No grand speeches, no philosophy of freedom, just sweat, splinters, and a roof slowly taking shape over a family. Yet the house is easier to build than the man who must live inside it. John's attempts at being a husband and father are awkward, endearing, and often painful. He stumbles through apologies, tries to ask Jack about books instead of guns, forces himself to listen when Abigail speaks of school and stability rather than adventure. How does a man taught that love is proven with blood learn that sometimes it is proven by coming home on time? But the past does not respect property lines. At night, Dutch's speeches echo in his head, Arthur's rasping last words bleed into nightmares, and every distant rider on the horizon might be a lawman, a Pinkerton, or a ghost. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, yet John cannot shake the sense that happiness is just another trap, that civilization only smiles so it can aim more carefully. Beecher's Hope becomes his triumph and his countdown clock. This is where John finally becomes the man he once pretended to be. This is also the place where that man will be measured, hunted, and, in time, executed by the very system he tried to join. For now, though, the ranch stands. The family breathes. And somewhere beyond those fences, agents are already drawing maps with his name on them. For a brief, fragile stretch of years, the story of John Marston stops being about gunsmoke and wanted posters and becomes about mornings. About chores, about the quiet, stubborn work of building a life that does not end with a noose or a bullet. At Beecher's Hope, the former outlaw rises with the sun, not to scout a bank, but to check on cattle and fences. That work becomes the living embodiment of his new philosophy. Every fence post he hammers in, every field he plows, is a small act of defiance against the world that once taught him destruction as a way of breathing. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and for the first time, John tries to be ahead of that change rather than dragged under it. The clearest sign of that change stands beside him on the riverbank. Teaching Jack to fish is not just a quiet minigame of frontier life. It is John trying, in the truest sense, to rewrite his own childhood. His father never taught him patience, never showed him pride that was not soaked in whiskey. So when Jack misses a cast, John bites back irritation, forces himself to explain again, and then again. When Jack finally hooks a fish, John's praise comes out awkward, halting, almost embarrassed, as if the words do not yet fit in his mouth. But they are there, and Jack hears them. From its humble beginnings as a marriage born in the chaos of a gang camp, John and Abigail's relationship also begins to settle into something steadier. At first, their evenings are filled with arguments about money and safety, about whether taking another risky job is worth one more month of comfort. Abigail has seen too many men swear they are done with the gun only to reach for it the moment the world pushes back. John has been that man. Now, the fights slowly give way to conversations about Jack's schooling, about books instead of bullets, about a future where their son's name is never spoken in a sheriff's office. Is that not the dream Dutch once sold them, stripped of the delusions and lies? Yet even as he leans into this new role, guilt walks with John across every acre. He knows that no number of plowed furrows can erase the bodies left behind from the gang's raids, from Blackwater to Beaver Hollow. The best he can imagine is a trade, one ruined life for another spared. If Jack can grow up believing that freedom means choice, not running from the law, then perhaps the ledger tilts a fraction toward redemption. In these years, John is as close to redeemed as he will ever stand. A husband trying to listen more than he shouts, a father teaching his boy to cast lines instead of draw guns, a rancher choosing creation over destruction day after day, post after post, field after field. But redemption in this world is not a destination. It is a brief stop on a road already mapped by others. And as John leans into this fragile peace, the men following that map are almost at his gate. The government has been patient. It is nearly done waiting. The knock on John Marston's door is not loud. It does not need to be. By 1911, the real power in this world does not shout. It arrives on schedule, in a pressed suit, with paperwork and armed escorts. Agent Edgar Ross steps onto Beecher's Hope as if he already owns it. Beside him, Archer Fordham and a couple of uniformed men stand in neat formation, the living embodiment of a new order that makes the old Pinkertons seem almost romantic. The world was changing, and where once Dutch van der Linde raged against railroads and banks, now the threat comes in the quiet confidence of federal authority. No masks, no bandanas, just badges and the certainty of law backed by rifles and telegraphs. From the very beginning, Ross makes it clear that this is not a visit. It is an audit of John's entire life. They know his history, almost as if they had been riding with the gang themselves. They recite his past crimes, his years under Dutch, his part in robberies from the Grizzlies to the Heartlands. They know about Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela, about Dutch's survival after the mountains, about the Blackwater disaster that marked the end of the old ways. Even his disappearances, his doubts, his attempts to walk away from the outlaw life are turned into lines on a file. This is not a negotiation, it is a calculation. John's freedom, his land, his fragile peace are all weighed against the government's desire to erase the last remnants of the van der Linde gang. The cruel bargain is presented with almost bureaucratic politeness. Abigail and Jack are taken into government custody, protective custody, Ross calls it, with a straight face, and John is informed that to see his family again, to keep this ranch from its humble beginnings alive, he must hunt down his former brothers. Bill first. Then Javier. Finally Dutch. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, rewritten as a federal checklist. For John, the horror is not simply the danger, it is the irony. He left that life behind. He bled in the snow and mud so that Jack could grow up hearing stories about fishing and fence posts, not shootouts and robberies. He tried, in the truest sense, to become what civilization claimed it wanted, a working man, a husband, a father. And now the same system that branded him an outlaw demands he become a killer again, this time with a government wage and a government target. Is there a deeper betrayal than being forced to destroy the only family ever known in order to save the new one built? Ross understands this pressure perfectly. He weaponizes John's love, turning the one good thing in his life into a chain. The old ways were dying, but they were not dying cleanly. They were being executed by men who needed someone else to pull the trigger. In that moment, John Marston stops being a rancher pretending to forget his past and becomes something far more tragic, a lost soul sent to erase his own history. The road back into violence is open, and the government is already waiting at the end of it. John's road back into hell begins with a familiar horizon. The desert around Fort Mercer is the same world he once crossed in freedom, a story of dust, gunsmoke, and stolen horses. Now those same canyons and arroyos are no longer a playground for an idealistic outlaw youth, but a corridor leading a government asset toward his own past. He rides the old routes the gang used to favor, the hidden gullies and dry riverbeds where they once vanished from Posses and Pinkertons. From its humble beginnings as a loose band of thieves with a philosophy, the van der Linde gang had treated these paths as arteries of possibility, veins of escape carved into the land. Now the tracks lead in only one direction, toward Fort Mercer, toward Bill Williamson, toward a man who never stopped being what John is being forced to pretend he has forgotten. Every hoofbeat is a reminder that the world was changing, and he is no longer outrunning civilization but serving it. Bill's transformation is carved into the walls of that crumbling fort. Once, he was the drunken butt of camp jokes, a man Dutch mocked and Arthur tolerated, held in place by a shared dream of freedom and family. Now, he has turned himself into a paranoid warlord, surrounding the old army post with his own gang of killers, hiding behind sandbags and gun ports, barking orders that echo Dutch's speeches in a cracked, desperate register. In the truest sense, Bill has become the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses: loyalty demanded, fear enforced, betrayal assumed. To the government men who hired him, John is a hero in training, a necessary instrument to clear the frontier of its remaining legends. To John, the truth is uglier. The plan to storm Fort Mercer with hired guns and a stolen armored wagon is not so different from the robberies Dutch once dreamed up around a campfire. The only difference is the paperwork afterward, and the invisible noose around Abigail and Jack. How much does a man really change if the work is the same? Only the signatures at the bottom of the orders are different. When the guns finally speak at Fort Mercer, the battle is brutal and swift. Bill flees across the border, but the siege marks a line John cannot uncross. In chasing him out and tearing down the little kingdom Bill tried to build from Dutch's broken philosophy, John helps erase another fragment of the world that raised him. This is loyalty twisted into a weapon, betrayal written into a contract. Bill's eventual downfall, hunted through the Mexican Revolution and gunned down in a crumbling fort of his own, becomes one more ghost on John's conscience, one more piece of his old life destroyed by his own hand. Each death is payment demanded, and the debt is nowhere near settled. Because after Bill, there is still Javier, and beyond Javier waits the man who taught them both what freedom meant. John's path to Javier does not lead deeper into the United States. It leads away from it, across the border, into a country tearing itself apart. To catch one man, John has to ride straight into a revolution. Mexico in 1911 is a mirror held up to the Van der Linde gang's past. Generals and rebels trading speeches about freedom and oppression, peasants caught in the crossfire. Civilization marching in with rifles and flags. The world was changing on both sides of the river, but in Mexico the change is loud, violent, impossible to ignore. It is a story of power and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, playing out on a national stage, and John arrives as the hired gun of a government that once called men like Dutch parasites. From the very beginning of this southern chapter, the irony is brutal. Years earlier, Dutch and Javier preached about standing with the poor against the rich, about resisting the old empires that carved up the world. Now John rides through villages burned by both federales and revolutionaries, hearing the same words used to justify new atrocities. Every speech from Colonel Allende, every promise from Abraham Reyes, sounds like an echo of Dutch in his grandest, most dangerous moods. In the middle of this storm stands Javier Escuella. Once the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic philosophy, he is now tangled in Mexico's civil wars, switching allegiances, working with whoever will keep him armed and moving. He still dresses the part, still talks about honor, loyalty, and freedom, still imagines himself an outlaw hero standing against corrupt civilization. But the cause keeps changing, and the bodies keep piling up. Is this resistance, or just survival in a different uniform? For John, every step toward Javier is a step toward the man he used to be. Javier represents the version of John who never left, who never tried to build a ranch or a family, who would have followed Dutch through every massacre and every delusion until the bitter end. Hunting him is not just a mission. In the truest sense, it is an argument with an alternate life. Each time Javier invokes Dutch's name, each time he insists they were fighting for something pure, John is forced to remember that once he believed the same thing. Their final confrontation in the crumbling Mexican fort carries all the weight of shared history. Both men accuse the other of betrayal. Javier claims John sold out the dream for a wife and a farm. John sees a man hiding behind dead words, using revolution as an excuse to keep running from the truth that the old ways were dying long before Blackwater. They are not just fighting for their lives, they are fighting over what their past meant. When Javier falls, captured or killed depending on the path taken, another pillar of the gang is torn down by John's own hand. Bill's fort, Javier's exile, each encounter strips away another layer of that outlaw family from its humble beginnings. Piece by piece, John is dismantling not only Dutch's empire, but his own identity, clearing the board for one last reckoning with the man at its center. Piece by piece, John has been tearing down the old gang's pillars. Bill in his crumbling fort, Javier in his jungle refuge, each encounter a mirror held up to who he once was. But in the end, all those roads lead to the same place, the cold, thin air of the mountains, where Dutch van der Linde is building one last dream out of ghosts and gunsmoke. John's approach to Dutch's new camp is a study in déjà vu and dread. Snow underfoot, hard men on the perimeter, hungry faces around thin fires. It is Coulter and Beaver Hollow all over again, only meaner and more desperate. Dutch has gathered a new generation of misfits and lost souls, indigenous fighters and disillusioned outcasts, promising them freedom from a civilization that has stolen their land and their future. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch is determined to weaponize that truth one final time. He has changed, and he has not. Older now, lined and weary, Dutch moves with a stiffness that was not there in 1899, but his voice still cuts through the wind. He paces before his followers, delivering those mesmerizing speeches about government tyranny, about an America that betrayed its own promises, about how only the outlaw standing outside the law can see the world as it really is. It is the same philosophy from its humble beginnings, only stripped of warmth, of family, of any real restraint. When John and Dutch finally stand face to face, it is not a reunion, it is an autopsy. Dutch mocks John for riding with federal agents, for wearing a badge in everything but name, accusing him of betraying everything they once stood for. How could the living embodiment of their old ideals become the government's hound? John fires back that Dutch abandoned that code long ago, when he left Arthur to die, when he sacrificed Hosea, when he chose Micah and money over loyalty and truth. Who really betrayed whom? Bullets fly in those mountains, but the real battle is ideological, in the truest sense. John is not only trying to stop Dutch, he is trying to prove, to himself as much as to his former mentor, that he has changed and Dutch has not. Dutch insists the government will chew John up and spit him out, that civilization has no place for men like them. John insists that family, land, and honest work can still mean something, that a story of blood does not have to end in blood. In the end, Dutch chooses his own verdict. Cornered on the cliff, hearing the echo of his own failures in John's voice, he steps backward into the void. It is escape and confession at once, a refusal to be caged, and an admission that his dream died long ago. John is left staring into the chasm, holding no clear victory, only another body and more questions about what any of it meant. And far below, unseen, the tide of history keeps moving, already turning toward Beecher's hope. Because Dutch's fall is not the end of this story. It is the last ghost John can chase before the ghosts come for him. Dutch's body falls, but his words hang in the air. We all make a choice. In that single line, the entire philosophy of the van der Linde gang, from its humble beginnings to its ruin, is stripped down to something cold and final. Dutch is not just talking about the leap. He is talking about the railroad, the telegraph, the Pinkertons, the barbed wire. He is talking about a world that chose civilization over the old ways. For Dutch, it is the last bitter verdict on a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and broken on the rocks of progress. In his mind, they were always doomed because the world was changing, because the old ways were dying, because men like him were never meant to survive the march of order. The choice, as he sees it, was never really theirs. The world chose for them. John hears something different within the same words. To him, we all make a choice lands as accusation and warning at once. Accusation, because Dutch has never forgiven the boy who left the gang, the surrogate son who tried to trade outlaw freedom for a quiet ranch and a real family. Warning, because John is standing there as a government attack dog, forced to put down the very man who once saved his life. How much choice does he truly have? This is the pattern interrupt. The outlaw who preached freedom now dies to prove how little freedom there ever was. Dutch's line tells John that no matter how many men he hunts for Edgar Ross, no matter how many times he swears he is done, the system will never really let him go. The government owns his past, and through that, it owns his future. Dutch's final act only deepens the ambiguity. Is the leap cowardice, a refusal to face judgment from John and the state? Is it defiance, a last gesture of control in a world that has stripped him of every illusion? Or is it, in the truest sense, a twisted mercy, a way to spare John from having to kill the man who was, more than anyone, his father in all but blood? The answer is all three, and none of them. From the very beginning, Dutch defined himself by the rope. He cut John down from a hanging when the boy was 8, stealing him from death and from the institutions that would have claimed him. Now, he cuts himself loose instead, refusing to let John, Ross, or the United States decide how his story ends. The man who once granted John a second life takes his own. And yet, standing over that ravine, John's sentence is not commuted. Dutch's death completes the government's mission on paper, but not in truth. The bill for the Van der Linde gang has not been fully paid. Beecher's hope still waits on the horizon, and the last choice John thinks he has is the very one that will bring the war to his front door. John rides back to Beecher's hope not as an outlaw on the run, but as a man who believes he has finally paid his debt in full. The blood of Bill, Javier, and Dutch is behind him, the government's ledger supposedly balanced. On the hill above the ranch, for a moment, it almost feels like the very beginning of a new life. Abigail meets him first, stepping out from the house with a look that is equal parts relief and accusation. She rushes to him, then hesitates, then holds him as if afraid he might vanish again. This is a story of a family stitched together by violence and promises, trying to pretend it can now be held together by ordinary days. Jack stands nearby, older than he should be, studying his father as though measuring the distance between the man in his memories and the man who finally came home. The government's word hangs over that reunion. Ross and his men have said their piece, John has done his duty, the slate is clean, the Marstons are free. No more chase, no more blackmail, no more noose waiting in some distant town. In the truest sense, it is everything John has been killing for. Freedom, land, family, and the quiet dignity of being left alone. So he throws himself into the work. Days become a rhythm of mending fences, breaking horses, and teaching Jack how to shoot, how to ride, how to read the land instead of wanted posters. He tries to replace the memory of Dutch's speeches with the sound of a hammer on nails, the echo of gunfire with the lowing of cattle. Each chore is a small act of defiance against his past, a refusal to be only the living embodiment of the Van der Linde gang's sins. Yet even in that fragile peace, the world was changing around him. Telegraph wires hum in the distance, trains whistle on the horizon, and John knows the old ways were dying, even out here. When Ross visits the ranch to check in, his words are polite, but his eyes count doors, windows, angles of fire. He calls John Mr. Marston now, but the title feels less like respect and more like a reminder of ownership. Is a man truly free when the people who claim to have released him still know every inch of his land? John senses it in quieter moments, a rider lingering too long on the road, a shape on a far ridge, the way Abigail stiffens whenever a stranger approaches the gate. He tries to dismiss it as paranoia, as the echo of years spent looking over his shoulder, yet the feeling never quite leaves. From its humble beginnings as a simple ranch, Beecher's hope becomes a calm surface stretched tight over deep, unseen currents. The storm has not passed. It has only drifted out of sight, gathering strength. And as the sun sets behind the house, the Marstons stand in its glow, unaware that the war John thought he ended is already circling back toward their door. So John gambles on the only thing he has left, time with his son. If the storm cannot be stopped, perhaps it can at least be redirected. Life at Beecher's Hope quickly becomes a story of small rituals and carefully chosen lessons. John takes Jack hunting, moving through the brush with a patience he never had as a young outlaw, pointing out tracks, wind, and sign. He lets Jack fire the rifle, but he talks more about respecting animals than killing them, turning what was once a tool of survival into a quiet classroom under the open sky. On fishing trips, the rhythm slows even further. The line drifts, the sun hangs over the river, and John edits his memories, trimming away blood and betrayal until they sound almost peaceful. Those rides between chores become the real lectures. Horse hooves beat a steady cadence as John tells stories of the old days, but the details are vague, the names blurred. He describes Dutch as a man who wanted freedom, not as the living embodiment of a collapsing philosophy. He speaks of long journeys, not botched robberies, of campfires, not corpses. From the very beginning of those talks, he is hiding the worst of himself, terrified that truth might be contagious. Instead, John pushes books into Jack's hands. Adventure novels, histories, anything that points toward a world beyond guns, dust, and barbed wire. He insists Jack read, insists he dream of civilization and classrooms and trains taken for travel rather than robbery. Education becomes his rebellion against his own past, his quiet war against the old ways that were dying but had never quite stayed dead. In the truest sense, he is trying to raise a boy who will never need to draw first. But curiosity is stubborn. Jack has heard whispers from Abigail, from old gang members passing through, from the way strangers sometimes look twice at John's scars. Who was Dutch? What did those men really do? Why does the name Blackwater make adults fall silent? Jack's questions cut deeper than any bullet, because they reveal a fascination with the very outlaw legend John spent his life bleeding to escape. Here lies the tragedy of John Marston as a father. His greatest teaching tool is regret. He can only point at his own scars and say, without saying, do not be this. He has no grand idealistic blueprint, no pure philosophy of freedom and justice, only a list of wounds and funerals. Can warning alone change destiny? Can absence of a path be a path? The world was changing, but not in the way John hoped. Beyond the fences of Beecher's hope, the government that once held a gun to his family's head is still watching, still calculating. His lessons bend Jack toward books and away from bullets, yet forces far larger than one ranch are already moving. The cycle John is trying to break has not ended. It is merely waiting for a new Marston to claim. The peace John builds at Beecher's hope is fragile, and from the very beginning it exists only because men in suits allow it to. To Ross and his superiors, John is not a redeemed husband or a reformed rancher. He is a loose end, an outlaw who has seen too much and killed too many on the government's behalf to ever be truly trusted. Ross's philosophy is simple and merciless. Outlaws do not retire, they are retired. John has hunted Bill, Javier, and finally Dutch, dismantling the remnants of the Vanderlinde gang that once called him family. On paper, he has fulfilled every condition of his bargain. In practice, he has only proven how dangerous he can be when pointed at a target. What happens when a weapon like that decides it wants real freedom? So the decision is made far from Beecher's hope, in quiet rooms where the world was changing and men talk about progress, order, and civilization. To them, John is a story of usefulness and exploration, of loyalty leveraged and then discarded. He is the living embodiment of a problem to be solved, not a man to be spared. Ross signs the orders, and the army saddles up. The day they come begins like any other. The sun climbs over the hills, dust hangs low over the paddocks, and John works the land he bled for. Then, on the horizon, a smear of motion, horses, wagons, the faint, growing thunder of hooves. At first, it could be travelers, or a patrol passing through, but the line is too straight, the formation too tight, the dust cloud too thick. This is not a visit. It is an approach. By the time John understands, it is already too late. Soldiers in blue and khaki fan out, rifles glinting, banners snapping in the wind. Machine guns are unlimbered, their barrels turning toward the ranch that was supposed to be his salvation. And somewhere behind the lines, at a safe distance, sits Edgar Ross, calm, detached, watching through field glasses as if observing a hunt. There is no satisfaction in Ross's eyes, no personal hatred that might at least make the betrayal feel human. Only procedure. John Marston is not the man who did his duty. He is the last remnant of a criminal era, a relic to be erased so the reports read clean. Dutch used to promise freedom after one last score. Ross promised freedom after one last job. Both men dangled dreams, then cut the rope the moment those dreams became inconvenient. Is there a more bitter irony than that? In that instant, John understands in the truest sense. The old ways were dying, and he is being buried with them. He drags Abigail and Jack to the barn, shoves them toward the back door, and with a few hurried words makes his choice. His life is over. Their story might not be. If his blood can buy them a few more years, a different fate, then the last Marston stand will not be on the run, but facing the guns head-on. The doors are about to open, and what waits outside is more than an execution. It is the end of an era and the beginning of something far darker for his son. So John makes his choice, and the choice is simple. The man who once ran from responsibility will now walk straight into death for his family. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, this is the moment where everything finally stops running. He ushers Abigail and Jack through the dim barn, past the tools and wagons that had been meant for a quieter life. The air smells of hay and dust, of horses and hard work. This is what he had tried to become: a rancher, a husband, a father, earning an honest dollar under a changing sky. He pushes them toward the back, toward the small side door and the slim chance at freedom, his hands firm but gentle, his voice low and urgent. There are no speeches, no grand philosophy, just a father moving his family out of the line of fire. Then comes the silence. He looks at Abigail, at the woman who saw him as more than an outlaw, and at Jack, the boy who once played with toy guns and asked stories of the old gang. 1,000 memories pass between them without a single word. From its humble beginnings in Dutch's campfire tales to this quiet, terrible barn, everything that ever mattered to John is standing right here. His eyes say what his tongue cannot. Live. Be better. Remember me for this, not for what came before. He closes the door on them and turns back toward the front of the barn. The light is a thin, blinding strip under the great wooden doors, harsh and white against the gloom. When he pulls those doors open, he does not sprint or dive for cover. He straightens his back. He smooths his vest. His body language is calm, almost formal, the living embodiment of acceptance. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and John Marston would not crawl into that new world on his knees. There is a cruel symmetry here. As a boy, he had been dragged half-dead from a rope by Dutch and Hosea, saved from a crude execution to become part of an idealistic family of outlaws. Now, in the truest sense, he chooses his own firing line so that Jack will never hang from a tree or rot in a cell for another man's dream. Dutch once cut him down to give him a life of crime. John steps out to be cut down so his son might escape it. The doors swing wide. Sunlight explodes across him, washing out the barn's interior, turning John into a dark silhouette against a wall of rifles and uniforms. Federal agents and soldiers stand in perfect formation, civilization's firing squad aimed at one tired rancher. For a heartbeat, everything holds. Then he reaches for his gun, not because he expects to win, but because he refuses to go meekly. The volley tears through him and through the barn behind. Wood splinters, tools shatter, beams shake. This place of work and creation, where he branded cattle and mended fences, becomes an execution ground. His dream of honest labor is literally riddled with bullets, the boards marked forever by the cost of his last stand. John stumbles, then falls forward into the dust, arms spread, the echo of gunfire fading into a heavy, unnatural quiet. Outside, the government has killed its problem. Inside, a father has sealed his legacy. The dust settles over his still body, but not over what he chose. They have ended the man, but not the message he leaves for Jack, that even a lost soul can decide at the end what his story truly means. The dust does not lie for long. Hoofbeats and wagon wheels break the silence, and the dream John built comes home to find him dead in the doorway of his own barn. Abigail and Jack step out into that heavy, unnatural quiet, and Beecher's hope, from its humble beginnings as a promise of freedom, becomes in an instant a crime scene, a sanctuary, and a tomb. They see him almost at the same time. John's body, crumpled yet strangely composed, framed by the splintered wood and bullet scars that mark where civilization finally caught up to him. Abigail's first sound is not a word but a broken, animal noise, the sound of a woman who has lost a husband, a partner, and the last link to a life that was already hanging by a thread. Jack just freezes. The boy who read adventure novels about heroic outlaws is staring at the final chapter of his own father's story. In that moment, Beecher's hope changes. The barn is no longer just where John taught Jack to work, to shoot, to ride. It is the altar where his philosophy is written in blood. Freedom has a cost. Family has a cost. Every fence post John hammered, every field he plowed, every board he nailed into that roof, now feels like part of a coffin he built around himself to keep Abigail and Jack safe. Abigail's burden settles on her shoulders fast. The government has taken John, but it has not taken their interest in the Marston name. She knows that the man who hunted them once can hunt them again, that John died to buy them a future she is not certain this world will allow. Can she protect Jack alone, without the gunman who stood between them and the advancing tide of the modern state? She has no gang now, no Dutch, no Arthur, no John, only a ranch, a boy, and the memory of a man who tried to change. For Jack, the trauma is quieter, but it cuts deeper. He adored his father, resented his absences, feared his temper, and still wanted to be him. Now he sees what that path really earns. Not legend, but a body in the dust and a widow screaming in a doorway. It plants two seeds in him at once, in the truest sense: resentment at a civilization that used his father and threw him away, and a cold determination not to be powerless again. The years that follow turn Beecher's hope into the living embodiment of that contradiction. By day, it is a working ranch, a story of survival told in cattle and harvests. By night, it is haunted. The old ways were dying, but John's shadow walks every fence line. His hat on a peg, his rifle above the mantel, the barn door that never quite shuts right where the bullets tore through. Each is a reminder that loyalty did not save him. Abigail does what she can. She teaches Jack to read better, to think, to understand that the world was changing, and that men like Dutch and John were swallowed by their own dreams and delusions. She wants him to be a quiet rancher, a man of books rather than guns. But the boy who watched his father fall does not forget. He carries those images with him as he grows, as his voice deepens, as his hands grow steadier around a revolver. And in time, Beecher's hope will see another Marston ride away from its gate, not as the idealistic farmer John hoped for, but as something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. The government ended one outlaw. It unknowingly created the next. 3 years pass. The dust settles on Beecher's hope, but not on the boy who watched his father die. In that quiet, in that supposed peace, the world was changing, and Jack Marston was changing with it. He grows into a young man who carries books as easily as his father carried rifles. John had forced letters and history into him from the very beginning, and it shows. Jack is more educated than John ever was, more introspective, more aware that the story of the West is a story of betrayal as much as freedom. Yet beneath the learning and the calm voice, the same anger simmers, the same sense of injustice that once drove Dutch's speeches and John's rebellions. He is the living embodiment of every lesson and every wound his family ever gave him. On the surface, he tries to honor John's dream. He keeps the ranch running, minds the fences, pretends that civilization has finally claimed the last Marstons. But the boy who saw his father gunned down by the government's hired killers does not forget names. One name in particular lingers, like a curse: Edgar Ross, the man who smiled, shook John's hand, and then ordered the firing line. Tracking Ross becomes Jack's quiet obsession. No gang, no posse, just a single determined rider following a paper trail through a world that believes the old ways were dying. He questions postmasters and townsfolk, government clerks and riverboat captains. He hears of a promotion, then a retirement, then a transfer to a sleepy post down south. Piece by piece, from its humble beginnings as a rumor, the trail sharpens into a destination, a riverbank in the heat of the Mexican borderlands. There, the great hunter of outlaws has become something smaller. Edgar Ross is retired now, spending his days with a shotgun and a sack of duck decoys, standing in the water as if the past cannot reach him. He does not recognize the young man who rides up on the shore. Why would he? To Ross, John Marston was a tool, and Jack was a child hidden in a farmhouse. Tools and children blur together over time. The confrontation is simple on the surface. A few questions, a denial, a flicker of recognition. Then the truth lands. Jack names his father, names the barn, names the betrayal. In that moment, the old agent finally understands what has come for him. Two men face each other across the river, hunter and hunted, though it is not entirely clear which is which. When the guns are drawn, Jack believes he is doing something righteous. How could he not? This is justice in the truest sense, the son avenging the father, closing a circle that began with a boy on a rope and a man on a cross of bullets. But the second he pulls the trigger, he steps fully into the world John died trying to keep him out of. The shot that kills Ross also kills the last fragile version of Jack who might have walked away. Ross falls back into the water, another body claimed by a land that has seen too many. Jack stands alone on the shore, revolver cooling in his hand, the echoes of the gunshot fading into the reeds. The Marston family revenge cycle is complete, but so is the transformation. In chasing justice, Jack has inherited an outlaw legacy, not a peaceful homestead. And as he turns from the river, a new question hangs over the fading frontier. What future can there be for a man born of so much blood? Jack's footsteps on that riverbank echo another man's path, and they raise a harder question than simple vengeance. If the son has become the image of the father, was John Marston ever truly redeemed? Or did his story prove that some debts can only be passed down, never paid off? On the surface, John's life after the gang is a story of redemption from its humble beginnings. He walks away from Dutch's crumbling philosophy, survives the government's leash, and fights to carve out a quiet corner of the world at Beecher's Hope. He marries Abigail in the truest sense, not just in name but in effort, working the land, fixing fences, teaching Jack to read instead of to shoot. When Edgar Ross finally brings the army to the ranch, John steps out of that barn and chooses death so that Abigail and Jack can live. In that moment, he is the living embodiment of a man who has rejected the outlaw dream and embraced family over freedom. Yet the path that leads there is soaked in blood. To earn that fragile peace, John serves as the government's attack dog, hunting down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and finally Dutch himself. These are not faceless enemies, they are former brothers, men who once pulled him from the noose and called him son. The same loyalty that once bound him to the gang is twisted into a weapon by civilization, and John pulls the trigger. Even before that, his hands are far from clean. From the very beginning, he robbed trains, stagecoaches, and banks, left bodies on muddy streets and in frozen woods, and helped fuel the chaos that brought the Pinkertons down on everyone he loved. And the cost does not end with him. John dreams of Jack becoming a writer, a man of words instead of bullets. But his own choices make that dream impossible. By killing his former friends for the state, he proves that violence is the only currency the New World respects. By dying in that barn, he teaches Jack that the system will always betray an outlaw who tries to go straight. Is it any wonder that the boy rides away from Beecher's Hope as another lost soul, not a farmer, but a gunman? In the world of Red Dead, redemption is never simple. The old ways were dying, but the new order is built on the same guns, only with better paperwork. Good intentions cannot erase systemic violence. They can only shift who benefits from it. John's story is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a man trying to outrun both Dutch's lies and the government's cold arithmetic. That tension feeds directly into a larger American myth. The outlaw who dies a hero, the man who earns forgiveness with one final stand, is a comforting tale that lets the system that used him walk away clean. If John's last act wipes his slate, does it also absolve the government that cornered him, the civilization that demanded his crimes, then executed him for committing them? So where does that leave his soul? Was that sacrifice at Beecher's Hope enough to redeem John Marston, or was he still paying on a debt that could never truly be settled? The answer lies not only in his death, but in what comes next for those left behind, and in the final judgment of a man who once believed he could be more than an outlaw. To judge John's soul, the story has to turn back to the man who first claimed it. Dutch van der Linde did not just give John a gun and a place to sleep. He gave him a name, a role, a philosophy. But was that salvation in the truest sense, or the beginning of a lifelong captivity dressed up as freedom? From the very beginning, John's bond with Dutch is framed as an act of mercy. An 8-year-old boy, half-starved and half-feral, dangling from a rope for stealing from the wrong man. Dutch and Hosea cut him down, nursed him back, and called it family. On the surface, it is compassion. Yet even that moment carries a question. Did Dutch see a child in need, or a blank slate for his dreams? A lost soul to be saved, or an asset to be shaped? Dutch's mentorship of John mirrors what he once did with Arthur, but with a sharper edge. He teaches John to read, to shoot, to think, to question the world as civilization closes in. He talks about freedom, about resisting a rigged system, about the old ways were dying and men like them standing against it. These are acts of care, almost paternal. At the same time, each lesson forges John into the perfect instrument for Dutch's philosophy, the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw son who will rob, fight, and bleed for the cause without truly owning his life. There are moments when Dutch's affection feels real. He praises John's courage, defends him in front of the camp, calls him my boy and my son, with a warmth that seems genuine. He trusts John with dangerous jobs, frames him as the future of the gang, and, for a time, John is the golden child who proves Dutch's creed can work. Yet in the shadows of that praise, Dutch never forgets John's absences, his doubts, his failures. When John disappears for a year before 1899, Dutch turns that past into a weapon, throwing it back at him whenever loyalty is questioned. That pattern only deepens when John begins to pull away. As Arthur grows wary of Dutch's delusions, John's own skepticism hardens. Dutch does not grieve the distance, he resents it. When John later works for the government in Blackwater's long shadow, Dutch's rage burns cold. It feels less like heartbreak over a lost son and more like wounded pride that his creation now serves the very civilization he swore to defy. In the end, Dutch's love, if it ever truly existed, is inseparable from control. He loves John most when John is useful, when the boy on the rope has become the man carrying his banner. The moment John chooses Abigail, Jack, and a ranch over the gang's dying dream, that love curdles into betrayal. And that raises a final question that will haunt the rest of this story. If a family's affection vanishes the moment its members choose their own path, was it ever family at all? From that question about family, the story turns toward a quieter, crueler possibility. What if the government had never come for John Marston at all? No Ross, no blackmail, no official badge standing in the doorway of Beecher's Hope. Would the man who once rode under Dutch's banner have finally outrun his own legend? Or was he already living on borrowed time? On the surface, the dream seems simple. John stays on the ranch. He raises Jack, fixes fences, breaks horses, and argues with Abigail over money and chores instead of gunfights and jailbreaks. Day by day, the outlaw becomes a husband and father in the truest sense, burying his past under calloused hands and honest work. In that version of the world, Beecher's Hope fulfills what the gang once promised from its humble beginnings: freedom, family, and a chance to live without running. There is evidence this future is not just wishful thinking. After Arthur's death and Dutch's collapse, John spends years trying to walk away. He lets Bill and Javier vanish into the distance. He does not go hunting them for revenge. His philosophy shifts from Dutch's grand speeches about civilization and corruption to something smaller and more fragile: Abigail's trust, Jack's safety, a roof that does not leak. The man who once robbed trains for an idealistic cause now worries about bank loans and bad harvests. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying in more ways than one. Even without Ross, John's past would have cast a long shadow across that valley. Former victims could have followed rumors of a scarred rancher with a familiar drawl. Bounty hunters might have traced old posters and half-remembered names. Surviving gang members, nursing grudges, or chasing the last embers of Dutch's dream could have ridden in, not to share a drink, but to settle scores. A story of freedom and redemption can turn back into a story of blood in a single afternoon. And then there is John himself. From the very beginning, he was a lost soul pulled from a rope and taught that a gun was the only way to matter. Restlessness lives in his bones. Even at Beecher's Hope, there is always one more job, one more ride to town, one more temptation to prove he is still the living embodiment of the man Dutch raised. Would guilt over Bill and Javier have finally driven him to hunt them down? Would a bad drought, a failed crop, or an insult from a banker have pushed him back toward the gun? This thought experiment reveals how trapped John truly was, caught between history and hope, between outlaw legend and domestic peace. The government did not create his doom from nothing. The danger was already there, circling. What Ross and his superiors did was far colder. They weaponized every vulnerability John carried, turned his loyalty to family into leverage, and used his love as the trigger that would end him. And their story with John is not finished yet. John's tragedy is not only a family drama or a tale of personal betrayal. It is a story of a nation changing its skin, of an outlaw who becomes the mirror for an entire civilization. From the very beginning, John is framed as the romantic figure the West promised, the boy cut from a hanging rope, raised among riders who claimed to answer to no flag, no judge, no ledger. In the truest sense, John grows into the living embodiment of the frontier myth. He is self-reliant, deadly with a gun, able to read the land and survive where others would starve. He rides with Dutch not just for money, but for a philosophy that says freedom is found beyond the reach of the courthouse and the bank. He lives by a personal code that is rough, inconsistent, often cruel, yet still recognizably a code. Help those the world forgets. Stand by family. Never bow to a tyrant. That is the dream Dutch sells, and for a time, John believes it. But the world was changing. Railroads carved through the wilderness John once crossed on horseback. Telegraph lines string across the sky, carrying news and orders faster than any posse. Pinkertons, federal marshals, and shadowy agencies arrive in towns that barely have a schoolhouse. The old ways were dying, and with them, the space where a man like John could exist outside the map. Every train that roars past Beecher's Hope is a reminder the frontier is no longer a place. It is a memory being paved over. When Ross forces John to hunt Bill, Javier, and finally Dutch, that shift becomes brutally clear. The same skills that made John an outlaw hero are repackaged as state assets. His violence is no longer freelance rebellion, it is paperwork-backed execution. The government does not destroy the frontier gunman, it drafts him. It turns the lost soul into a temporary employee, weaponizing his loyalty to family and his talent for killing, then pretending it is all in the name of progress and law. John's dream of a ranch, of being a small landowner with Abigail and Jack, should be the reward for his sacrifice. It is, on paper, the American promise: work the land, raise a family, live in peace. Yet that dream is precisely what makes him vulnerable. The state that claims to protect property and order rides artillery onto his fields, tears his barn apart with machine-gun fire, and leaves his body bleeding in the doorway of the home he built. What kind of civilization calls that justice? In the end, John's story is a story of the West consuming itself. The outlaw world he helped build is hunted down to make way for a cleaner, more organized order, but the means do not change. The guns are the same. The blood is the same. Only the signatures at the bottom of the orders are different. The Old West kills itself so the new America can be born, and that new America still runs on the same bullets, the same fear, the same quiet graves on lonely hillsides, just with different paperwork to file afterward. And in the middle of that paperwork and quiet murder, one man's life becomes the thread that ties the gang's past to its future. John Marston is not just another outlaw ground up by civilization. He is the living embodiment of what Dutch claimed to believe in, and the proof of how far Dutch falls from it. From the very beginning, John's path runs parallel to Arthur's. Both are rescued as boys. Both are raised on Dutch's sermons about freedom. Loyalty and family, both are pointed at the world as instruments of a philosophy that promises justice while dealing only in theft and blood. Arthur dies trying to make that philosophy mean something again, trying to save at least one person from the wreckage. John lives long enough to test whether redemption can actually survive contact with reality. One becomes a martyr to a dream. The other has to wake up and live with what the dream cost. Arthur's faith in John is not sentimental. It is strategic, almost ruthless. Dying on that mountain, Arthur does not ask John to avenge him or to keep riding for Dutch. He orders him to leave, to be a husband, to be a father, to build a quiet life on a patch of land instead of chasing trains and glory. Arthur's belief that John is the one who can escape becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It shoves John toward choices he might never have made alone, toward abandoning the gang, toward swallowing his pride for Abigail, toward accepting honest work that feels, in the truest sense, more terrifying than any gunfight. How many times does John push forward later simply because a dying man once told him he could? Jack stands as John's mirror in inversion. From its humble beginnings in the camp at Horseshoe Overlook, John and Abigail fight clumsily, imperfectly, to give Jack what they never had: books instead of bullets, stories instead of scars. Jack grows up more educated, less directly criminal, watching the outlaw world from the edge rather than the center. Yet the same forces that kill John, government coercion, private greed, the slow cage of civilization, drag Jack back toward violence. He inherits not Dutch's speeches, but John's grudges. In the end, the boy raised on dime novels becomes the man who hunts down Edgar Ross, turning his father's desperate attempt at a clean legacy into just another bloodstain. Around them, the rest of the gang forms a ring of dark possibilities John could have become. Bill Williamson, clinging to Dutch out of fear and pride, shows the path of the man who never questions, who mistakes bluster for courage. Javier, torn between old loyalty and self-preservation, becomes the expatriate forever running from a past that never stops chasing him. And Micah Bell is the nightmare version of John, all resentment, no restraint, a lost soul who embraces betrayal as a survival strategy. Each of them is a story of what happens when Dutch's rhetoric outlives Dutch's humanity. John carries pieces of all of them: the stubbornness, the charm, the cruelty, the capacity for love. From orphaned boy cut down from a rope, to gang enforcer, to reluctant homesteader, to doomed father standing in a barn door, his life traces the gang's most complete arc. The old ways were dying around him, the world was changing faster than any gun could keep up. Yet John tries, again and again, to ride both directions at once. The question is not just whether he succeeds. The question is what that attempt leaves behind, and who is forced to live with the ruins of his choices next. What survives when the gun smoke clears, when the last outlaw falls, and the government writes the final report? In the ruins of John's barn, and on the banks where Jack faces Edgar Ross, the question of Dutch's dream lingers like an echo that refuses to die. From the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy promised freedom from corrupt institutions, a chosen family bound by loyalty, and a life apart from what he saw as civilization's hypocrisy. He preached that banks, railroads, and governments were parasites, and that men and women could live by their own code, in the truest sense, if they only had the courage to stand outside the system. In Dutch's speeches around campfires, the gang was more than a crew of thieves. It was meant to be the living embodiment of a different world. But the world was changing, and Dutch changed with it, or rather refused to. Those ideals that once sounded idealistic and almost noble were slowly twisted by his ego and the pressure closing in. After Annabelle's death, after Blackwater, after Hosea's murder, Dutch's dream hardened into delusions. Suspicion became his religion. Betrayal became his expectation. The man who claimed to fight senseless violence began to justify massacres in Guarma, executions in the swamps, and the sacrifice of his own people as necessary. Freedom, family, philosophy, all three were bent around one man's wounded pride. John's life becomes a story of what fragments of that dream could still be salvaged. Arthur's warnings and sacrifices push him towards something quieter: a ranch, a wife, a son, a roof that is paid for with sweat instead of blood. Beecher's hope is Dutch's rhetoric stripped of its self-importance. No manifestos, just fences, cattle, and a man trying to be better than the outlaw he was raised to be. In his devotion to Abigail and Jack, in that final decision to step out of the barn and face the guns alone, John proves that one part of Dutch's promise was real. Found family was worth dying for. Yet his death passes the burden to Jack, and here the legacy curdles again. Jack inherits Dutch's skepticism of authority without Dutch's charisma, John's pain without John's second chance, Abigail's resilience without the camp that once gave those traits direction. He grows up on government lies and campfire stories, in a world where the old ways were dying and nothing coherent replaces them. So when he hunts down Ross, is it justice? Or just another boy reenacting a philosophy he never fully understood? The Van der Linde legacy becomes a cautionary tale, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and scattered in the wind. Ideals without accountability drift into cults of personality. Rebellion without a plan is easily bought, redirected, and turned into a weapon for the powerful. Dutch raged against civilization, John tried to live within it, Jack is left between them, a lost soul on a shrinking frontier, proving that some revolutions end not with victory, but with a single gunshot and a name forgotten in a file. And yet, the story is not quite finished. Because one man refuses to leave the mind once his part is done. John Marston steps off the stage, the curtain falls, the guns go silent, and still the questions echo. Why does this particular outlaw refuse to fade into the background of a dying West? Part of the answer lies in his relatability. John is not a legend carved from marble. He is a man constantly pulled in two directions, between the blood on his hands and the hands of his wife and son at the dinner table. He is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a lost soul trying to live a decent life in a world that keeps dragging him back into the mud. He wants freedom, but freedom has a cost, and that cost is never paid just once. The structure of experiencing his life only sharpens that impact. For many, John first appears in Red Dead Redemption as the finished product, a grizzled, sarcastic gunslinger, a reluctant government hound stalking former comrades across a frontier that the world was changing out from under. He is competent, cynical, quick with a dry remark when two men try to rob each other on a dusty road, and he seems, at first glance, fully formed. That is the John who dies in the barn at Beecher's Hope, riddled with bullets, framed as the tragic end of a Western hero. Then, Red Dead Redemption 2 rewinds the reel. From its humble beginnings in the gang's golden years, the audience sees a younger John, hot-headed, insecure, disappearing for a year when Jack is born, clashing with Dutch and Arthur, failing in ways that make the older man's scars suddenly make sense. This reverse chronology turns his life into a slow-motion tragedy. Every small moment of growth, every quiet scene building a house with Uncle, every hesitant apology to Abigail is haunted by the knowledge of that barn door sliding open. How can hope feel safe when the ending is already known? The games deepen this by inviting active participation in his redemption. In the very beginning, John is Dutch's golden boy. By the end, he is Arthur's last chance to prove that the gang's philosophy can produce something good. Players ride with him, work his ranch, make choices that nudge him toward responsibility and away from the old ways that were dying. So when he steps out to face the firing line, it does not feel abstract. It feels earned, and it feels personal, as if every robbery refused, every debt paid, every fence mended helped walk him there. In the truest sense, John lingers because his story asks a question that civilization never stops asking. How much of the past can truly be outrun? How far can a man ride from the sins that made him before they ride back under a government seal or an old partner's shadow? The next chapter of this tale begins with the answer written in Jack Marston's eyes. That answer is already there. In the barn. The doors swing open, the light floods in, and John Marston steps out into the rifles of a world that has finally caught up. From its humble beginnings on a rope in the dirt to this last walk through dust and sunlight, his life has been a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of one outlaw trying to stand between a dying frontier and an unforgiving civilization. That final stand only truly makes sense when traced back to the very beginning, to another noose and another man looking up at death. John was a boy of 8 when Dutch and Hosea cut him down from a hanging and pulled him into their circle. Dutch did not just save a child, he adopted a cause. In that frightened, angry boy, he saw a blank page for his philosophy, a chance to prove that the world was changing, but a chosen family could still be built out of the broken. From there, loyalty became the spine of John's existence. Loyal to Dutch as a surrogate father, eager to impress, desperate not to be abandoned again. Loyal to the gang as a young man, riding on robberies, laughing at campfires, believing that this ragged caravan of misfits was in the truest sense a better answer than the cold institutions that had failed him. And finally, loyal to Abigail and Jack, the family carved out of that chaos, the one thing he chose rather than had chosen for him. But every loyalty in John's world carried its own betrayal. Dutch's moral collapse began long before the cliffs above Beaver Hollow, and every promise of freedom paid for with someone else's blood. The gang that called itself family fractured under pressure. John disappeared for nearly a year. Arthur's resentment festered. And Abigail's past with other men in camp left John half in love, half ashamed. Even before the Pinkertons closed in, the old ways were dying inside the gang's own circle. When the government came, it did not need to break John's code, it only needed to weaponize it. Edgar Ross took the one thing John would never abandon, Abigail and Jack, and turned that devotion into a leash. Hunt Bill. Hunt Javier. Corner Dutch. Each ride against his former brothers was both a service to civilization and a quiet execution of the boy Dutch had raised, a story of a man dismantling his own past at gunpoint. So when the army lines up outside Beecher's Hope, John is not simply an outlaw being put down. He is the living embodiment of a frontier myth that can no longer be tolerated, and a husband who has finally chosen his family over his freedom. What does his last step out of that barn really buy? What does it cost to try to change who a man is when the world has already decided what he has been? The answers wait in the echo of those gunshots, and in the shadow they cast over Jack Marston's future. What those gunshots buy is not a clean slate, but a choice. John Marston's life is a story of a man who learns, far too late and at terrible cost, that redemption is not about erasing blood from the record, but about deciding, again and again, whose safety is worth his own death. In a world where the old ways were dying and civilization called itself progress, that decision is the only freedom he ever truly owns. From the very beginning, John is shaped by other men's choices. Orphaned, thrown into reform school, nearly hanged as a boy, he is literally cut down from the rope by Dutch and Hosea and remade in their image. Dutch teaches him that an outlaw can be a hero if the story is told right, that robbery can be a philosophy, that family can be found at the end of a gun. John believes it. He becomes the golden boy, the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic dreams of freedom and resistance. But those dreams demand a price. John learns to kill for the gang, to raid homesteads, to spill blood in the name of a better world. When he disappears for a year before 1899, chasing some fantasy of responsibility and failing Abigail and Jack, Dutch calls it betrayal. In truth, it is the first clumsy attempt of a lost soul to step outside the role he was handed. He fails. He comes back scarred, mistrusted, pulled between loyalty to Dutch and the fragile family he barely understands how to protect. By the time the government finds him in Red Dead Redemption, the irony is complete. The same system that hunted the gang now needs what men like John can do. Agent Edgar Ross takes Abigail and Jack, not because John is special, but because love is the perfect leash. The state that once turned a blind eye to frontier violence now condemns it, weaponizing a husband and father's guilt to dismantle the only family he ever knew. It is cruelty dressed as law, a story of civilization punishing the very monsters it helped create. John fails there, too. He cannot keep Jack from seeing death. He cannot keep Abigail from knowing what he has done. He cannot escape the government's noose tightening around Beecher's hope. Yet in the truest sense, he succeeds in the one way that matters. He becomes a different man than the boy Dutch rescued from that hanging tree. He hunts Bill, Javier, and even Dutch not for Dutch's philosophy, not for money, but to buy a quiet life for his family, however fragile. That final walk out of the barn is the culmination of every step Arthur took toward the light, and every step Dutch took into delusion. Arthur dies begging John to be better. Dutch dies a hollow echo of his own rhetoric. John is the proof that Arthur's sacrifice was not wasted, and that Dutch's fall was not inevitable. Faced with the same choice Dutch always claimed to cherish, freedom or family, John finally chooses. He opens the doors, steps into the rifles, and in that instant, he is not an outlaw dying. He is a father staking Jack's future on his own body. Yet what does that future become when Jack grows up to follow the same bloody trail, gun in hand, hunting Edgar Ross by the riverbank? What if John's greatest victory plants the seed of his son's downfall, and the cycle that began under Dutch's banner has not truly ended at all? John's last stand raises a question that refuses to die with him. Was that walk into the barn the act of a redeemed man, or the final payment on a debt that could never, in the truest sense, be cleared? From its humble beginnings, John's life was a story of violence inherited rather than chosen. An orphan, a reform school case, a boy nearly hanged until Dutch and Hosea cut the rope and called it mercy. Dutch framed that rescue as salvation, as freedom from a cruel civilization, but was John ever truly forgiven for the blood that followed, or merely useful enough that his sins could be folded into the gang's philosophy and worn as a badge? The heart of it turns on John's relationships, especially with Dutch. Did Dutch ever love John as a son, or was that bond always transactional, measured in loyalty, usefulness, and obedience? Dutch taught him to read, to shoot, to speak about dreams and delusions, yet the moment John disappeared for that lost year before 1899, the mask slipped. Dutch never really let that betrayal go. When the world was changing and the old ways were dying, John became proof, in Dutch's mind, that family could not be trusted once civilization dangled a safer life. So what was Dutch to John in the end? A father, a captor, or the living embodiment of a promise that could never be kept? Dutch's final words on the cliff, that weary John, "I did my best," echo over Beecher's hope as much as over Arthur's grave. Were those words confession, self-pity, or one last attempt to control the story? There is another question, quieter but just as sharp. If the government had never intervened, if Edgar Ross had never weaponized Abigail and Jack as hostages, would John have stayed a rancher, or would the outlaw in him have clawed back to the surface? The barn, the plow, the quiet evenings with his family suggest a man desperate to believe in a different future. Yet this is also the same man who once rode with Bill and Javier, who learned that power comes from the gun, not the deed to the land. Different moments in John's journey strike different hearts. For some, it is Arthur's sacrifice on that bloodred ridge, handing John the chance he would later spend in that barn. For others, it is Dutch's last, broken retreat from the cliff, or Jack standing over Edgar Ross, revolver smoking by the riverbank. Which moment hit hardest? And why? Share those answers, those interpretations, those favorite scenes of John Marston's life and death. Because his story of freedom, family, loyalty, and betrayal is not finished until the echoes it leaves in this world are spoken aloud. John's story echoes because it never truly stands alone. It is a story of one man's struggle for freedom and family, but it is also just a single thread in a much larger tapestry, woven from the very beginning of the Van der Linde gang to the last fading embers of the dying West. From its humble beginnings, this world was changing around Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and the boy they pulled from a noose and named son. John Marston's life cannot be separated from the philosophy that shaped him, the campfire arguments that educated him, or the broken men and women who stood beside him. To understand John in the truest sense means seeing him not as a lone outlaw, but as one orbit in a collapsing solar system. Consider Arthur Morgan's full journey. Where John lives long enough to test Dutch's dream against a fence line in a homestead, Arthur dies on a mountaintop, trying to make peace with his own sins. His slow awakening, his battles with illness, his choice to help John escape the gang's gravitational pull. These moments are the living embodiment of the gang's conscience. Without Arthur's rise and fall, John's eventual stand at Beecher's hope loses half its weight. What does John's stubborn hope mean if the man who first cleared a path for it is forgotten? Then there is Dutch himself, the architect of both men's lives. His psychological unraveling, from idealistic teacher to paranoid prophet, runs parallel to John's arc. Dutch once rescued John from a hanging. Years later, he leaves him bleeding in the snow. Dutch preaches freedom from civilization, yet ends up hiding behind government agents and foreign wars. A full descent into Dutch's mind, his rhetoric, his justifications, his delusions, turns John's betrayal into something far more complicated. Who truly betrayed whom? Beyond them waits Jack Marston, the quiet child reading by the fire, the boy stolen in Rhodes, the teenager forced to bury his father. John's death is not the end of this saga. It is a handoff. Jack's unknown future beyond Edgar Ross's death, his choice to become the very outlaw his father tried to escape, asks a final question. Did John die to break a cycle, or to prove it could never be broken? These are not side notes, they are the other faces of the same coin. Dutch's ideology in Blackwater, Abigail's perspective on loving a man who keeps riding away, a full breakdown of the ferry job that doomed them all. Each is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, unfolding in the same collapsing world where the old ways were dying. For those who wish to see how John Marston's life fits into that greater saga of freedom, family, and civilization closing in, the next rides await. Return for Dutch's fall, Arthur's awakening, Abigail's reckoning, and Jack's inheritance of the gun. John's tale is complete, but this West has many more ghosts to follow. John Marston's life, in the truest sense, is a story of a rope, a rescue, and a choice made in a dusty barn years later when the world was changing and the old ways were dying. From its humble beginnings at the end of that noose, everything else follows. A boy of 8, terrified and alone, feels the rough fibers bite his neck, hears the crowd murmur, and then watches Dutch and Hosea ride in as outlaws playing savior, turning a hanging into a baptism into their strange new family. From that moment, John grows up in gunsmoke and campfire light, a lost soul sharpened into an instrument. Dutch teaches him that freedom is stolen, not granted. Hosea teaches him that survival is an art. The gang shows him that loyalty can feel holier than law. Robberies, train jobs, shootouts in half-built towns. This becomes his civilization. Is it any wonder he mistakes Dutch's philosophy for truth? In that roaming camp, John is Dutch's golden boy, the living embodiment of the gang's future, proof that broken children can be reforged into something fierce. Then Abigail, fierce and wounded in her own right, turns that roaming world into something messier. She has been with other men in the gang, she has seen the worst of outlaw life. Yet with John, she finds a fragile hope, and Jack becomes the question neither Dutch nor John knows how to answer. Can an outlaw raise a child without handing him the gun? John runs once, disappearing for nearly a year, chasing some dream of being more than Dutch's shadow, and in that absence, Dutch's pride curdles. The first betrayal is not John leaving the gang, it is Dutch deciding that John's doubt is unforgivable. By 1899, when Blackwater goes bad and Arthur begins to see through the dream, John is pulled between two fathers and one small boy. Wounded in the snow, left behind, he feels the edge of Dutch's abandonment. Arthur's sacrifice, the rides through mud and fire to save John's family, carve a new path in his mind. Perhaps freedom is not Dutch's speeches, but a quiet ranch, a fence, a school book in Jack's hands. Yet even as the gang collapses, civilization has already marked him. So when the government comes with papers and polite threats, it does not need chains. It has Abigail. It has Jack. John hunts Bill, Javier, even Dutch himself, tearing down the only family he ever knew to protect the one he built. Beecher's hope rises from blood and compromise, a fragile kingdom of cattle and chores, a man trying to outwork his past. But the state that used him cannot afford legends. The army rides. The barn doors close. John steps out into the sun and chooses the bullet Dutch once stole from him, so that his son will not inherit the same rope. And years later, when Jack stands alone with his father's gun, the myth is complete and the question remains, was this freedom, or just another story of the West devouring its own children? John's death leaves a question hanging in the dust, but that question does not belong to the game alone. It belongs to everyone who has ever ridden beside him, watched him fail, watched him try again. This is not just a story of an outlaw gunned down by civilization. It is a mirror held up to those who cared about him. For some, the very beginning of that bond came with a burned, scarred man riding into Armadillo, muttering about government men and old debts. For others, it began in a snowstorm at Coulter, with a half-frozen rider stumbling back to camp, already limping from the wolves and from Dutch's disappointment. Which John stepped out of the mist first, the reluctant government gunman of Blackwater's aftermath, or the young father limping through Red Dead Redemption 2, trying to earn back a family he abandoned? Those first impressions matter. Did Dutch's golden boy appear as a gruff, world-weary survivor who had already lost everything, or as a reckless youth still half in love with the gang's idealistic dream of freedom? Did that initial meeting make him seem heroic, hypocritical, or simply human? In the truest sense, that first ride defines whether his later choices feel like betrayal, or a desperate attempt to grow beyond the barn he was born into. Across this long saga, John wears many faces. There is the brash teenager Dutch pulled from a hanging, the living embodiment of a second chance. There is the young, reckless outlaw who vanishes for a year, chasing his own dreams while Abigail and Jack wait in a camp that calls itself family. There is the conflicted father at Beecher's Hope, trying to mend fences, plow fields, and teach Jack to read instead of shoot. And finally, there is the resigned man in the barn, stepping toward the light. Which version speaks the loudest? Which one feels closest to the truth? Every rider carries a different answer. Some see redemption in John's refusal to run when the army comes. Others see redemption earlier, in the quiet work of building a ranch, or even in the moment he turns his gun on Dutch's old lieutenants for Jack's sake. Was his redemption a single heroic act, or a slow, stumbling crawl away from Dutch's philosophy and toward something resembling peace? And when Jack stands over Edgar Ross years later, is that justice, or the old ways dying one bullet too late? Beyond that final duel, imagination takes over. Does Jack become nothing more than another lost soul, drifting through a world that was changing long before he was born? Or does he find a different path, one the games never show, where Beecher's hope becomes more than a gravestone for a family's dreams? The comments can become a campfire, a place where conflicting readings sit side by side, where one writer's John is a tragic hero, and another's is a man who never quite escaped his own delusions. Voices answering voices, stories answering stories. That is how a tale from its humble beginnings in a burned-out gang camp turns into a shared legend. Because the next step in this journey does not ride alone. It rides with every interpretation, every argument, every quiet confession about what John Marston meant. And beyond John, there are still other riders in the dark, waiting for their turn under the sun. And beyond John, there are still other riders in the dark, waiting for their turn under the sun. Yet for now, everything circles back to one place, one moment, one set of doors closing on an outlaw who tried to outrun the world and found it waiting in his own front yard. The barn at Beecher's Hope stands there again. The same rough boards, the same dust, the same creak of hinges that once framed John's last walk into the light. But after tracing his path from its humble beginnings in a noose and a gang camp to that quiet ranch, those doors are no longer just wood and iron. They are the living embodiment of every choice that led him from Dutch's dream of freedom to a smaller, humbler dream of family. John Marston was never only a victim of civilization's advance, nor some flawless frontier hero riding in to save the day. He was, in the truest sense, a man who tried, failed, tried again, and then chose to walk away from Dutch when the philosophy turned into delusions, chose to crawl back from a bullet in a blizzard for Abigail and Jack, chose to serve the very system that hunted him, because that system held his family at gunpoint. In a world where the old ways were dying, he did not die clinging to an ideal. He died holding on to the people that ideal had forgotten. This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, a family forged in fire and tested by progress. Dutch preached freedom while becoming a prisoner of his own paranoia. The government promised civilization while using blackmail and murder as its tools. John stood between them, an outlaw groomed by one machine and consumed by another, proof that the world was changing, but not always in the ways its prophets claimed. Who truly betrayed whom? The gang that abandoned him, the government that discarded him, or the civilization that pretended it had no use for men like him even as it cashed their blood? From the very beginning, John's life showed how systems exploit the very people they claim to civilize. A boy saved from a hanging becomes a gun hand for a cause he barely understands. A husband and father becomes a government weapon aimed at his own past. And when the shooting stops, those same forces write him out of the story, leaving only a widow, a son, and a weathered ranch on the edge of nowhere. Yet the journey through his life, through every campfire, every betrayal, every desperate bargain, means that Beecher's Hope can never again be just another backdrop in a Western. That barn at dusk now holds the echo of Arthur's sacrifice, Dutch's failures, Abigail's faith, and Jack's inheritance. Its doors stand closed, the gunfire long gone, the dust settling in the last red light of day. But stories like John Marston's do not end with the last shot or the last breath. They ride on in every memory, every retelling, every quiet moment, when the West feels a little less myth and a little more human, and the barn at Beecher's Hope still waits in the fading light.